Chapter 1 On Becoming John Rambo, An Overview of American Madness. Rampage, verb, a course of violent, riotous, or reckless action or behavior. Noun, violent behavior that is reckless, uncontrolled, or destructive. The amok man is patently out of his mind, an automaton oblivious to his surroundings and unreachable by appeals or threats. But his rampage is preceded by lengthy brooding over failure and is carefully planned as a means of deliverance from an unbearable situation. From Steven Pinker, How the Mind Works, 1997. His was an impenetrable darkness. I look at him as you peer down at a man who is lying at the bottom of a precipice where the sun never shines. Charles Marlowe, protagonist in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, 1899. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang but with a whimper. From T.S. Eliot, The Hollow Man, 1925. The Many McVeighs. Much has been written about Lee Harvey Oswald, who, according to the well-known narrative, on November 22, 1963, at the age of 24, fired 3 shots from the 6th story of the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas, wounding Texas Governor John Connally and killing President John F. Kennedy, after which he escaped the scene via city bus, taxi, and on foot, headed to a movie theater, and shot and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit along the way. After a booth attendant called the police to report that a man had entered the theater without buying a ticket, the police arrived and arrested Oswald. Depending on the account, Oswald either willingly submitted to police or put up a struggle and had to be subdued. Either way, he was charged with the murders of Kennedy and Tippit, but adamantly denied involvement in either of the deaths. During a transfer from the Dallas police headquarters to a county jail, he proclaimed to journalists and television crews, "I didn't shoot anybody, I'm just a patsy." 2 days later, Oswald himself was shot and killed on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. This much we think we know. Oswald's brief life was marked by complexity and contradiction. His father died before he was born, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings. His mother moved often, from Louisiana to Texas to New York, and by the time he graduated high school, Oswald had attended 12 different schools. Although he read voraciously and had a high IQ, he had great difficulty writing and spelling. Those who knew him at a young age described him as introverted, moody, and argumentative. When he was arrested for repeated truancy in the 7th grade, the juvenile psychiatrist who evaluated him reported that Oswald was absorbed within a, quote, vivid fantasy life, turning around the topics of omnipotence and power, through which he tries to compensate for his present shortcomings and frustrations. By 15 years old, he was a self-proclaimed socialist and Marxist. The next year, he joined the Civil Air Patrol in New Orleans, a right-wing-leaning organization, but surely one perceived as patriotic. At 17, Oswald quit school and joined the U.S. Marine Corps because, according to his older brother, he hoped to get out and under the yoke of oppression of our mother. While in the Marines, he was trained as a radar operator, obtained a security clearance, qualified as a sharpshooter, and took, but did poorly on, a Russian language exam. Although one of his commanding officers described him as a very competent crew chief and, quote, brighter than most people, Oswald expressed pro-Soviet sentiments and on a number of occasions was court-martialed, once for accidentally shooting himself in the elbow with a handgun he was not authorized to possess, and another time for fighting with a sergeant. His various court-martials led to imprisonment and demotion. At the age of 20, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, where he lived for 3 years and met and married his wife Marina, before returning to the U.S., claiming he became disillusioned with life in the USSR. In March 1963, Oswald allegedly purchased a rifle and revolver through the mail, using the alias A. Hidell, and purportedly used the revolver in an attempt to shoot U.S. Major General Edwin Walker, a rabid right-wing anti-communist segregationist. The next month he moved to New Orleans, where he began propagating pro-Castro literature, but paradoxically associated with a number of notable right-wing individuals who had very rabid and vocal anti-communist and anti-Castro political beliefs. These individuals included, among others, former FBI agent Guy Bannister, CIA asset David Ferry, and local businessman Clay Shaw. In New Orleans, Oswald briefly worked at a coffee company until July 1963, when he was fired for reading rifle and hunting magazines while on the job and for loitering in general. That September, he is reported to have visited the Cuban embassy in Mexico, seeking a visa that would allow entry into Cuba, where he planned to stay before traveling on to the Soviet Union. Facing a delay in processing the visa, Oswald headed to Dallas, where he rented a room under the name O.H. Oswald, had some contact with FBI agents, and got a job at the Texas School Book Depository. Despite numerous official and citizen investigations and the many theories surrounding it, the JFK assassination and Oswald's subsequent murder ushered in not only an era of televised death spectacles via politically motivated assassinations and random public shootings with no apparent political motivation committed by lone nuts, but also the age of rapidly proliferating conspiracy theories, the formation of conspiracy cultures, and a deep cynicism and distrust in the official stories about any one of these incidents and the creation of alternate counter-narratives. Within a few years of Oswald's appearance on the public stage, a number of other equally frustrated and listless lone nuts emerged. These included 25-year-old Charles Whitman, who, in August 1966, killed his wife and mother in their home and then commenced a sniping spree from a tower at the University of Texas, killing 16 people and wounding 32 others, before being shot and killed by an Austin police officer. Whitman, like Oswald, reportedly grew up in a physically and psychologically abusive home and went on to join the U.S. Marine Corps. Footnote: in a note written the day before the tower incident, Whitman wrote, "I do not really understand myself these days. I'm supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I cannot recall when it started, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts." He asked that his brain be studied by scientists who could figure out what was wrong with him. End footnote. 2 years later, in April 1968, James Earl Ray allegedly assassinated Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and a little over 2 months after that, in June 1968, 24-year-old Sirhan Sirhan purportedly killed presidential nominee Robert F. Kennedy. Arthur Bremer. Included among this growing family of lone nuts was 22-year-old Arthur Bremer, whose attempt to assassinate presidential candidate George Wallace with a .38 revolver during a campaign rally left Wallace paralyzed from the waist down and critically wounded 3 others. Members of the crowd tackled Bremer, and he was arrested. Bremer grew up in an abusive and highly dysfunctional home. He later explained that as a child, quote, "I would escape my ugly reality by pretending I was living with the television family, and there was no yelling at home or no one hit me." Although Bremer was gifted with a high IQ, he consistently received low grades, had trouble making friends, and found school to be a lonely and torturous experience filled with bullies who scorned and ridiculed him. After graduating high school, he enrolled in college, where he was remembered as a strange, aloof, and argumentative fellow who rarely talked to anybody. Bremer dropped out after 1 semester and got a job as a busboy, but after customers complained about his bizarre mannerisms, including talking to himself out loud, he was demoted. When he demanded his demotion be reversed, an evaluator reported that Bremer, although a conscientious worker, bordered on the paranoid. He quit his job and for the next 2 years worked as an elementary school janitor, during which time he became increasingly suicidal. In October 1971, Bremer was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon and was pronounced mentally ill by a court-appointed psychiatrist. Soon after, Bremer purchased a .38 revolver. Footnote: 1 week after the 1971 arrest, Bremer met a woman named Joan, whom he began dating, but she broke up with him after a number of incidents involving his inappropriate and weird behaviors. Bremer refused to accept the breakup, shaved his head, and began stalking Joan. End footnote. On March 2, 1972, Bremer wrote in his diary, quote, "It is my personal plan to assassinate by pistol either Richard Nixon or George Wallace," and that his purpose was, quote, "to do something bold and dramatic, forceful and dynamic, a statement of my manhood for the world to see." He then began to stalk Wallace, following him throughout the country. More attracted to the idea of killing Nixon, on April 11th of that year, Bremer traveled to Ottawa, Canada, where Nixon was making a public appearance, but decided against killing him due to the high level of security there. After returning to his home state of Wisconsin, Bremer took 2 books about Sirhan Sirhan out of the library and wrote in his diary, quote, "I am as important as the start of World War I. I just need the little opening and a second of time." He then turned his full attention to Wallace, although somewhat less enthusiastically, as Wallace was not as well known as Nixon, and his death, quote, "won't get more than 3 minutes on the network TV news." Still, on May 9th, Bremer visited Wallace's local campaign headquarters and continued to follow him and attend his rallies. The day he set out for Laurel, Maryland, where Wallace was to appear next, Bremer wrote, quote, "My cry upon firing will be, 'A penny for your thoughts. Copyright 1972, all rights reserved, Arthur H. Bremer.'" On May 15, 1972, Bremer, wearing dark glasses, red, white, and blue clothing, and a Wallace in 72 campaign button, attended a campaign rally for Wallace. As many in the crowd jeered Wallace and even threw tomatoes at him, Bremer feigned support for him by loudly cheering and applauding. Due to the crowd's harsh perception of him, the candidate did not interact with the crowd after his speech, and Bremer found no opportunity to enact his plan, but succeeded later that day at another rally just a few miles away. When police searched his apartment, they found shell boxes, a Confederate flag, pornography, Black Panther literature, newspaper clippings, Wallace campaign buttons, a book entitled 101 Things to Do in Jail, and a number of diary entries, including ones that read, quote, "My country 'tis of thee, land of sweet bigotry, cheer up Oswald," and "White-collar, conservative, middle-class, Republican, conservative robot." In his car, which investigators described as a hotel on wheels, were pillows, blankets, a tape recorder, a radio with police band, binoculars, a 9mm automatic pistol, and the 1972 edition of Writer's Yearbook. During his trial, his defense attorneys argued that Bremer was schizophrenic, legally insane, and had, quote, no emotional capacity to understand anything. But prosecutors argued otherwise and said that, while perhaps the man was disturbed, he knew what he was doing when he attempted to kill Wallace and had done so to get attention, even calculating his arrest and subsequent media coverage of his trial. After a jury found him guilty, at the conclusion of his sentencing hearing, Bremer was given the opportunity to speak and said, quote, the prosecutor said that he would like society to be protected from someone like me. Looking back on my life, I would have liked that if society had protected me from myself. That's all I have to say at this time. He was sentenced to serve 63 years in prison, but the sentence was appealed and reduced to 53 years. In 2007, after serving 35 years, at the age of 57, Bremer was released from prison and placed on probation until 2025. In their 1977 book, Snapping, America's Epidemic of Sudden Personality Change, Flo Conway and Jim Siegelman proclaimed that a rapidly growing, quote, epidemic of sudden personality change existed in America, a cultural phenomenon they dubbed snapping, wherein normal individuals undergo startling personal transformations that sometimes lead them to engage in acts of random violence. To help understand the emergent phenomenon, the authors introduced their theory of communication disorders, and a particular subset of these that they termed information diseases, or IDs. They described IDs as, quote, alterations in a person's information processing capacities that, unlike momentary, episodic, and individualized snapping, results in a prolonged and, quote, marked change of awareness, diminished conscious control, and persisting impairments of a person's everyday powers of thinking, feeling, perception, memory, imagination, and conscious choice. Writing long before the emergence of the World Wide Web, the authors attributed America's ID epidemic to the unique stresses of modern life, especially information overload, as well as other isolated or ongoing traumatic experiences that, in combination, quote, lead to the physical breakdown of a person's entire ability to make sense of his experience, making them more suggestible to outside influences and rendering them, quote, prone to uncontrollable urges and sudden outbursts of violence. One such trauma, called information stress, resulted from obsessive absorption with computers, television, or other modern-day hobbies, noting that recent generations, quote, have been molded not by rich real-life experiences, but information imparted electronically via television, film, computers, and other advances in communication technologies that convey, quote, narrow, shallow, and violent images and messages, lead to crises of identity at best, and actual violence at worst, and render people mere, quote, holograms of the society they inhabit. While the most common IDs led to, quote, ongoing altered states of awareness, when in a more advanced and extreme stage, the delusional stage, an individual's ability to distinguish reality, fantasy, and delusion is impaired, causing them to suffer vivid delusions and confusion about whether they are actually awake or dreaming. In 1978, the year following the publication of Snapping, Theodore Ted Kaczynski began targeting individuals in some way connected to modern technology through planting or mailing homemade bombs that, from 1978 until 1995, killed 3 people and injured 23 others. His bombing campaign ceased when he was apprehended in April 1996 after his brother tipped off the FBI to Kaczynski's whereabouts in Lincoln, Montana, where he lived a hermetic life in a cabin without electricity or running water. After pleading guilty, he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. As a child, Kaczynski was often sick and frequently hospitalized for various ailments, including recurring hives. He feared other children and refused to interact with them, leading his mother to seek help for what she believed to be autism. He was, however, highly intelligent and completed high school by the age of 15. At 16, he began attending undergraduate classes at Harvard University. While there, he, along with several other undergraduate students, became a subject for psychological tests conducted by a former interrogator for the World War II intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services, Henry Murray. The tests, which lasted several months, sought to measure reactions to extreme stress and distress. Students wrote essays about themselves, were taken into a room and placed in a seat facing bright lights and a two-way mirror, hooked up to electrodes, and then berated, belittled, and subjected to brutal verbal attacks directed at their egos and beliefs. The experience and their reactions to it were filmed and then played back to them repeatedly throughout the course of the study. Kaczynski's brother said that prior to his participation in the test, his brother had been emotionally stable. In 1962, at the age of 20, Kaczynski graduated from Harvard and enrolled in a doctoral program at the University of Michigan, where he earned a PhD in mathematics. While there, he taught courses and published a number of papers. In 1967, he graduated and was recognized by the school for writing the best dissertation in his field that year. That same year, he began teaching geometry and calculus courses at the University of California, Berkeley. Students complained about his teaching style, told administrators that he was very nervous in a teaching environment, and said he sometimes stuttered and mumbled during lectures. 2 years later, he resigned from his teaching position and moved to his cabin in Montana, where in 1978 he began his bombing campaign. In 1995, he sent a number of letters to his victims and packages to media outlets. The packages contained his 35,000-word manifesto entitled Industrial Society and Its Future, commonly referred to as the Unabomber Manifesto. He demanded that outlets publish the manifesto and promised to cease the bombings if they did. Eventually, in September 1995, after he threatened to kill more people because outlets had delayed publishing his writings, the New York Times and Washington Post complied with his demands. The writing advocated world revolution against modern society and its industrial technological system, which he said, among other things, had destroyed human autonomy, degraded their relationship to nature, and caused them to, quote, behave in ways that are increasingly remote from the natural pattern of human behavior. This system, unless it was destroyed, would evolve until human freedom was destroyed altogether. He railed against the system for causing individuals to become overly socialized, and expressed his belief that modern psychological problems were the result of individuals having to live in physical and social environments and behave in conforming ways that are radically different from those in which humans had originally evolved to exist. Further, according to Kaczynski, the system had developed various methods of controlling individual and group responses to their unnatural and extremely stressful environments. Quote, imagine a society that subjects people to conditions that make them terribly unhappy, then gives them the drugs to take away their unhappiness. Science fiction? It is already happening to some extent in our own society. It is well known that the rate of clinical depression had been greatly increasing in recent decades. We believe that this is due to disruption of the power process. The entertainment industry serves as an important psychological tool of the system, possibly even when it is dishing out large amounts of sex and violence. Entertainment provides modern man with an essential means of escape. While absorbed in television, videos, etc., he can forget stress, anxiety, frustration, dissatisfaction." End quote. When he read the manifesto in the newspaper, his brother recognized Kaczynski's writing style and alerted the FBI, who then arrested him. The first psychiatrist appointed by the court diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, but nevertheless found him fit to stand trial. Experts who evaluated him later came to disagree with the diagnosis. While his attorneys wanted to plead insanity in order to avoid a death sentence, he adamantly insisted he was not insane, and so, in order to avoid the publicity of a trial, Kaczynski agreed to plead guilty in exchange for life in prison. While incarcerated at a federal supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, Kaczynski met, corresponded with, and became friends with Timothy McVeigh. In a number of letters to his biographers, McVeigh referred to Kaczynski as his kindred spirit. Mark David Chapman. On December 8, 1980, 25-year-old Mark David Chapman shot and killed musician and cultural icon John Lennon in the lobby of his New York City apartment building, after which he calmly remained on the scene, reading J.D. Salinger's 1951 novel The Catcher in the Rye. When the police arrived shortly afterwards, Chapman took off his coat to show the police he had no hidden weapons, told them he had acted alone and that the novel was his statement, and explained to them, quote, "I'm sure the big part of me is Holden Caulfield, who is the main person in the book. The small part of me is the devil." Soon after, he claimed he could not remember aiming his gun at Lennon, but only recalled pulling the trigger. In the years after his arrest and conviction, Chapman disclosed that, as a child, he feared his father, who was unloving towards him and physically abusive towards his mother. To cope, Chapman retreated into a fantasy life where he became king of a colony of little people who lived in his bedroom walls. In high school, Chapman, who was bullied for his poor athletic ability, began using drugs, skipping classes, and running away from home. When he was 20, Chapman enrolled in college and began working for the YMCA and World Vision, counseling young Vietnamese refugees in Arkansas and Beirut, Lebanon. Despite his seeming successes, when he and his girlfriend began having problems that led to their eventual breakup, Chapman became suicidal, dropped out of college, and moved to Hawaii. At the age of 22, after an unsuccessful attempt to end his own life with carbon monoxide, he was admitted to a hospital for psychiatric treatment, where he was diagnosed with clinical depression. At age 23, inspired by the book Around the World in 80 Days, Chapman toured the world for 6 weeks. Footnote: when working for World Vision, first with Vietnamese refugees housed at a resettlement camp in Arkansas, then with refugees in Lebanon, in time Chapman became an area coordinator and key aide to the program's director, who invited Chapman to attend meetings with high-level government officials. End footnote. Upon returning to Hawaii, Chapman married his travel agent. He said that about a year later, on the heels of some frustrating life events, he resumed his relationship with his childhood imaginary friends, the Little People, developed an obsession with John Lennon, and his fixation with The Catcher in the Rye became a full-fledged obsession. The year before he killed Lennon, Chapman wrote a letter to a friend in which he told her, "I'm going nuts," signing the letter The Catcher in the Rye. Although previously a fan of Lennon, and later claiming he had no particular feelings about Lennon one way or the other, those who knew him said Chapman, an aspiring musician himself, became angered when Lennon publicly rejected the existence of God and declared that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Chapman railed against Lennon for espousing a message of peace and love and rejection of capitalistic trappings while accumulating great wealth, traits antithetical to Catcher-in-the-Rye protagonist Holden Caulfield's ideal of anti-phoniness. Chapman, attempting to diffuse the perception that he shot Lennon simply to get attention, explained, quote, "I understood that it was necessary for a man to die. A phony man had to die. But what a beautiful foundation was laid by his death. I became that book." A couple months before the shooting, Chapman informed his wife that he planned to kill Lennon, but perhaps not taking him seriously, she failed to notify authorities. On October 23rd, Chapman quit his job as a security guard, and on his last day, signed out as John Lennon. Days later, he bought a .38 caliber pistol. Prior to leaving his New York hotel room early on the morning of December 8th, Chapman carefully placed various personal items around his room for police to find later, including cryptic writings and a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, in which he had written, "This is my statement." Chapman arrived at Lennon's residence early that morning and waited there the entire day. He observed Lennon leaving the building at around 5 p.m., but only asked him to autograph an album cover. When Lennon returned around 10:49 p.m., Chapman fired 5 shots at Lennon, hitting him 4 times. Lennon was pronounced dead about 15 minutes later. A psychiatrist retained by the defense team diagnosed Chapman with schizophrenia and said that the voices of the little people in his head had ordered him to kill Lennon. After this initial evaluation, the defense and prosecution called in additional mental experts to evaluate him, who found him to be, among other things, delusional, suffering from grandiose visions of himself, and possibly psychotic, but still sane and competent to stand trial. Chapman's defense attorneys still planned to argue an insanity defense. However, shortly before the trial, Chapman informed his legal team in the court that he wished to change his plea to guilty, as this was the will of God, and denied having ever heard voices. In 1981, the presiding judge accepted his guilty plea and sentenced Chapman to 20 years to life and psychiatric treatment. Since then, Chapman, who remains married to his first wife, has been denied parole 8 times and will be eligible for parole hearings again in 2016. John Hinckley Jr. On March 30th, 1981, John Hinckley Jr. shot at President Ronald Reagan with a .22 revolver as Reagan exited the Washington, D.C. Hilton Hotel, where he had just finished a speaking engagement. Although Hinckley failed to kill Reagan, he did manage to wound him, along with 3 others, including 2 Secret Service agent and White House Press Secretary James Brady. Hinckley was quickly apprehended. When he was searched, police found a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. Hinckley grew up in a wealthy family with elite political connections, including the Bush family. He played on a number of school sports teams, was a talented pianist, popular with his classmates, and twice during high school voted class president. Despite his popularity, Hinckley became withdrawn and isolated. After graduating high school, he attended a college in Texas on and off until 1980. During this time, in 1975, he relocated to Los Angeles to pursue his dream of becoming a songwriter, but was unsuccessful. In the many letters written to his family while there, Hinckley complained of his professional and economic frustrations and told them about his girlfriend, Lynn, who in reality did not exist. The following year, 1976, he returned to live at the home of his parents, at which time he began taking psychiatric medications, antidepressants and tranquilizers, purchasing and familiarizing himself with firearms, and grew obsessed with the 1976 movie Taxi Driver, its fictional protagonist Travis Bickle, played by Robert De Niro, and the film's lead actress Jodie Foster. In the movie, loosely based on the exploits of Arthur Bremer, Bickle, a disaffected Vietnam veteran, plans to assassinate presidential candidate Senator Charles Palantine, but after being observed by the Secret Service at a campaign rally, abandons his plan. He then develops a protective relationship and obsession with a child prostitute played by Foster's character. He successfully encourages her to turn her life around. After becoming obsessed with the movie, Hinckley began stalking Foster, sending her letters, phoning her, and attending a class at Yale University where Foster was enrolled. He devised and then abandoned several schemes to write himself into history and thereby impress her, including hijacking an airplane and committing suicide in front of her. Hinckley then began collecting literature about extremist groups and American assassins, including Lee Harvey Oswald, purchased a .22 pistol and Devastator exploding bullets. He then set his sights on President Ronald Reagan. In his efforts to impress Foster, Hinckley considered assassinating Senator Edward Kennedy and stalked him for a brief time, but eventually settled on assassinating President Jimmy Carter, thereafter following him throughout several states until being arrested on a firearms charge. He then returned home and sought psychiatric treatment. Various psychiatric evaluations diagnosed Hinckley with schizophrenia, dysthymia, a type of prolonged depression, as well as narcissistic, schizoid, borderline, and passive-aggressive personality disorders. In 1982, Hinckley successfully pled not guilty by reason of insanity and was remanded to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Hinckley had a significant effect on the role of mental health in criminal prosecutions. After his trial, a number of states modified their laws regarding the insanity defense, some completely abolishing it.
Hinckley, perhaps more than any other lone nut before him, sparked gun control debates that eventually led to the passage of the Brady Bill, gun control legislation named after Jim Brady, the press secretary whom he had wounded. In 1987, Hinckley was granted the privilege of regular overnight stays with his parents, and in January 2015 told reporters that he hoped to be deemed eligible for release soon, and described his recent efforts to get a job at Starbucks. Footnote: after one ruling in 2009, Hinckley's privileges expanded, allowing him to leave the hospital for up to 10 days at a time, although he was forbidden to speak with the media, whom he aggressively courted, and required to carry a GPS cell phone with him at all times in order to track his movements. End footnote. A number of conspiracy theories, or alternate narratives, have been constructed to explain the actions of this progression of assassins, just as they were about McVeigh, as well as the other lone nuts who followed him. Many times, these alternate narratives involved claims that the particular shooter under discussion had been set up by the CIA, FBI, or both, and sometimes that they were hypnotized or brainwashed or programmed assassins of the Manchurian Candidate variety. In April 1995, lone wolf Timothy McVeigh joined a long line of disaffected, listless, and fantasy-prone American males who commit highly public, violent crimes. Media outlets and commentators frequently made comparisons between McVeigh and nearly all of the previous lone gunmen, although none so much as Lee Harvey Oswald, with whom he appeared to have the most in common. His defense attorney, Stephen Jones, described McVeigh as a demonized symbol of American terror, and on several occasions likened him to Oswald. For instance, in 1997, the Toronto Star deemed both Oswald and McVeigh, quote, blank slates on which the nightmare side of American life can be projected, spiritual brothers and true representatives of a type that emerges every now and then to act out a recurring American nightmare, end quote. The article pointed out the many similarities shared by Oswald and McVeigh. Both came from broken homes, were bullied as children, loved guns, joined the military, and subsequently left under, quote, a cloud of unknowns. Both grew frustrated by their many life failures, by their mid-20s had achieved infamy by committing highly public murders, and ultimately died in a storm of publicity nearly as intense as that surrounding the acts they committed. The article closed with the warning that acts like Oswald and McVeigh's, quote, will happen again in America surely, on some day when its inhabitants are not expecting bloodshed. In the second edition of their book, released in 1995, Conway and Siegelman discussed, quote, the rise in reported incidents of people snapping suddenly and violently, and sensational crimes, mass slayings, and quieter instances of people snapping in everyday life situations, end quote. Average everyday people were being, quote, pushed to the breaking point and beyond, and becoming anxious, confused, overwhelmed, overloaded, vulnerable to manipulation, and ultimately less capable of thinking and acting as fully human beings, end quote. They attributed this situation to, quote, traumatic social, political, and technological transitions in cultures besieged by fanatical mindsets and apocalyptic messages, masses of information, mountains of technology, and an explosion of new experiences, increased pressures on minds and bodies, new strains of illnesses, spreading social turmoil, and the breakdown of basic human bonds and supporting social structures, end quote. In this second edition, Conway and Siegelman included chapters about the events at Waco and the OKC bombing, using the actions of Timothy McVeigh as the latest example of prolonged snapping. To them, both Waco and the OKC bombing indicated a much larger group of, quote, vulnerable minds that have increasing difficulty distinguishing literal messages from metaphors, end quote. They noticed an increased suggestibility found in children who space out while consuming television or film media, and pointed out that by the time they reach adolescence, the average American has spent tens of thousands of hours in front of television sets, has watched as many murders and engineered acts of violence, and has been exposed to hundreds of thousands of commercials filled with, quote, arbitrary symbols of coded commands and meaning. Although not noted by the authors, McVeigh had watched the fire that killed the Davidians at Waco live on television, while the Davidians themselves likely only watched live TV on any regular basis in the hours leading up to their deaths. The authors concluded that, quote, the profusion of engineered images, experience, and environments had not only undermined traditional institutions, example, nuclear family, education, work, government, religion, but, quote, made information stress a fact of life, and ominously but accurately warned readers that, quote, the phenomenon of increased snapping seems to be accelerating as a tumultuous millennium approaches. In the years following the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing and the second edition of snapping, a slew of highly dramatic and public mass shootings and other spectacles of terror and death occurred, several during the writing of this book. Unlike many of the previous acts of often random and always highly public violence, these newer and increasingly frequent spectacles seem to have less defined or sometimes no clearly political motivation other than the frustrations of the violent actors. Stories told about these newer lone gunmen inevitably reflected recurring elements found in those told about other legendary infamous American assassins and gunmen in history. All the lone nuts are predictably and, without fail, compared to Timothy McVeigh, himself an archetype, and his name is shorthand for young, angry, and violent dealers of unexpected mass death. The modern-day Oswalds, Hinkleys, Whitmans, and Chapmans are likewise regularly depicted as alienated, disaffected, bullied, antisocial loners, young men lost in a violent fantasy world, inspired by and drawing upon recurring images, archetypes, and cultural scripts in popular media. Their construction and enactment of these scripts has been attributed to a number of actual or perceived intolerable life circumstances and dysfunctions, psychological, familial, social, cultural, and political, shared by the loners. Columbine. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, both 17 years old, are credited with ushering in the Age of the Mass Shooter and the American school shooting epidemic on the morning of April 20th, 1999, Hitler's birthday, when they arrived at their high school in Columbine, Colorado, bearing an array of illegally purchased guns and explosives. During their subsequent shooting spree, they killed 13 and wounded 31 others before killing themselves. Fellow students later described Harris and Klebold as outcasts who obsessively surfed the internet, played video games, and had, in the year leading to the shooting, adopted a paramilitary fashion style. Others noted that the shooters held extremist, anarchistic, and unabashedly racist political views and had an interest in the doomsday prophecies of Nostradamus. Nothing indicated that either had an abusive or in any way troubled home life, and no comfortable or familiar psychological explanation based on individual trauma could explain their act. Rather, they were reportedly inspired by Oklahoma bomber Timothy McVeigh, all three the victims of vivid millennial dreams. While not the first school shooting or random public one, the distinctive style in which they carried out their horrific fantasy, at the time the deadliest school shooting in American history, changed discourses about violence, and the ensuing media spectacle they starred in gained them celebrity, inspiring copycat shooters. Footnote: from Charles B. Stroger, Youth Violence and the Apocalyptic, The American Journal of Psychoanalysis, 62, No. 3, 2002. Not discussed in this book, but among the shooters to emerge prior to the Columbine incident were 32-year-old Frederick Martin Davidson, August 15, 1996, and 16-year-old Kip Kinkle, May 20, 1998. End footnote. Luke Helder. In 2002, 21-year-old Luke Helder injured 6 people with 18 pipe bombs filled with BBs and nails and left in mailboxes rigged to detonate upon opening. Along with the bombs were notes detailing Helder's anti-government beliefs and warnings that mailboxes are exploding. Helder had placed the bombs in locations over a distance of 3,200 miles, including Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Colorado, and Texas. He had chosen his targets so that the bombs would create a smiley face across the United States map, an idea he borrowed from the 1999 film Fight Club. Helder, a seemingly average kid by most accounts, was in a 3-piece grunge rock band called Apathy, whose only CD was titled Sacks of People. His professors at the University of Minnesota, which he attended at the time, described him as a good, quiet, and polite student. Just prior to the bombings, Helder sent a 6-page letter to his school newspaper explaining how each person has the ability to create their own reality, and that, quote, once you begin to realize the potential you have as a consciousness/soul/spirit, you will begin to harness the abilities you have to produce realities, end quote. He described the bombs as attention getters and explained, quote, I'm taking very drastic measures in an attempt to provide this information to you. I will die/change in the end for this, but that's okay. Ha ha ha, paradise awaits. I'm dismissing a few individuals from reality to change all of you for the better. I'm doing this because I care. In the end, you will know I was telling you the truth anyway, end quote. Helder later said that both the bombings and the manifesto were intended to gather media attention so that he could inform the public about government control and promote marijuana legalization and astral projection. Helder was found incompetent to stand trial in 2004 and remanded to the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota, where he remains. Footnote: school shooters who emerged in the period after Luke Helder, 2002, include, but are not limited to, 42-year-old Peter Odekizuwa, 2002, and 41-year-old Robert Flores, 2002. End footnote. Sung-Wee Cho. At 6:47 a.m. on April 16, 2007, after a 5-year respite from the massive carnage caused by these snappers, 23-year-old college senior Sung-Wee Cho, armed with .22 caliber and 9mm semi-automatic handguns, entered a dormitory on the Virginia Polytechnic Institute at State University, Virginia Tech campus, and shot and killed 2 students. He then went to his own room, changed his clothes, deleted his emails, and removed the hard drive from his computer. About 2 hours later, Cho went to a post office near the campus and, using the name A. Ishmael for the return address, mailed some of his writings and a videotape to NBC News. He then walked back to campus and, carrying a backpack containing chains, locks, a hammer, 19, 10, and 15-round magazines, 400 rounds of ammunition, and his guns, entered a building full of engineering classrooms and lecture halls, chained the front door shut, and placed a note on it warning that if the door was opened, a bomb would go off. Cho proceeded to the second floor, looked inside several classrooms, entered one, and opened fire. He eventually murdered 30 students and professors and wounded 17 more before fatally shooting himself in the head. When the body was examined, the words Ishmael Axe were found scrawled on his arm. Cho, a remarkably shy and quiet individual, suffered from selective mutism, severe depression, and anxiety. He had been subjected to merciless bullying prior to and during his time as a student at Virginia Tech. In 2005, he was accused of stalking 2 female students, and his English teacher complained about his bizarre classroom behaviors and disturbing writings. After an investigation, he was declared mentally ill and ordered to get treatment if he wanted to continue to attend school. In a suicide note left in his dorm room prior to the shooting, Cho railed against rich kids, debauchery, and deceitful charlatans. The package sent to NBC contained pictures of Cho holding his guns, his 1,800-word manifesto, and 27 videos of himself in which he aimed his guns at the camera, ranted about the rich, compared himself to Jesus, and extolled other, quote, martyrs like Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. In one, Cho stated, quote, "You had 100 billion chances and ways to have avoided today, but you decided to spill my blood. You forced me into a corner and gave me only one option. The decision was yours. Now you have blood on your hands that will never wash off. You just loved to crucify me. You loved inducing cancer in my head, terror in my heart, and ripping my soul all this time." In another he said, quote, "I didn't have to do this. I could have left. I could have fled. But no, I will no longer run. It's not for me. For my children, for my brothers and sisters that you fuck, I did it for them." The Virginia Tech Review Panel concluded that Cho was unable to handle the stress and fright he felt about the many responsibilities he would face after graduating, and thus created and became immersed within a fantasy in which, quote, he would be remembered as the savior of the oppressed, the downtrodden, the poor, and the rejected. His thought processes were so distorted that he began arguing to himself that his evil plan was actually doing good. His destructive fantasy was now becoming an obsession, end quote. In the aftermath of the Virginia Tech massacre, as it came to be known, a number of troubling questions were raised. Proper emergency response measures were reevaluated, as were privacy laws that prevented school officials from learning of Cho's previous mental health issues. The year after the shooting, gun control legislation was signed into law that mandated improvements to federal databases used to determine eligibility for gun purchases. Major Nidal Malik Hasan. Ongoing debates on whether mass shootings constitute acts of terrorism, legally or in practice, became more salient when, on November 9, 2009, 39-year-old Major Nidal Malik Hasan, an Islamic U.S. Army psychiatrist, arrived at work armed with a semi-automatic pistol fitted with 2 laser sights, a .357 revolver, and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Hasan sat at a cafeteria table briefly, suddenly got up from his seat, yelled Allahu Akbar, and then began shooting at uniformed personnel. A civilian police officer shot him, leaving Hasan permanently paralyzed from the waist down, but not before Hasan had killed 13 people and wounded more than 30 others. Upon graduating high school, Hasan joined the Army and attended college while serving as an enlisted soldier. He earned a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Virginia Tech and a medical degree from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in 2003. While an intern and resident at Walter Reed Medical Center from 2003 until 2009, he completed a master's in public health and a 2-year fellowship in disaster and preventative psychiatry at the school's Center for Traumatic Stress. Hasan received poor evaluations from his superiors and was reprimanded for substandard work. Students and faculty there found him to be socially isolated, deeply troubled, disconnected, aloof, paranoid, belligerent, and schizoid. On a number of occasions, his colleagues reported his strange behaviors to superiors, and in 2008, the staff and board of directors called a meeting to discuss the reports. In the summer of 2009, Hasan began working at the Soldier Readiness Processing Center of Fort Hood, treating soldiers immediately before and after deployment. His colleagues there described him as anti-American, and at one point the FBI had even conducted an investigation into Hasan's online correspondence with known Islamic radicals. One family member said Hasan became noticeably more agitated after his parents' deaths in 1998 and 2001. Another told of Hasan's complaints of being harassed and discriminated against at work because he was a practicing Muslim and had expressed his desire to leave the military. And yet another said that Hasan became appalled and turned against the U.S. after hearing stories from patients who had recently returned from Iraq and Afghanistan. About a month before the shootings, Hasan was notified that he would be deployed to Afghanistan, and he began to give away his belongings. He began visiting a gun range where he became proficient at hitting silhouette targets from up to 100 yards away. An Army Sanity Board found Hasan sane and fit to stand trial. While the Department of Defense classified the incident as workplace violence, a Senate report described the Fort Hood shootings as the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil since September 11, 2001. Media outlets noted that Hasan represented the worst example of lone wolf terrorists self-radicalized by the internet. Hasan was found guilty and sentenced to death. Jared Lee Loughner. On January 8, 2011, 24-year-old loner Jared Lee Loughner appeared at a crowded supermarket parking lot in Tucson, Arizona, where Democratic Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was hosting a meet and greet for her constituents. Loughner opened fire on the crowd gathered there, killing 6 and wounding 13 others, including Giffords, who barely survived. Upon his arrest, Loughner, who appeared calm, said he pled the Fifth and stated, quote, "I just want you to know that I'm the only person that knew about this." When the FBI searched his house, they found bomb-making components locked away in a safe. A friend of Loughner's said he had a troubled home life and was constantly the brunt of his father's criticisms and anger about minor things. Others who knew him said that growing up, Loughner had been a talented musician, but was shy and had low self-esteem. Still others described him as generally a happy, friendly, well-liked, sweet and caring kid. A number of people noted that in the years leading to the shooting, his personality changed drastically and he just wasn't the same. Loughner became increasingly withdrawn, detached, weird, noticeably disturbed, someone you couldn't figure out, an oddball and social outcast whose internal world had clearly gone awry. After dropping out of high school in 2006, Loughner began working at a Quiznos restaurant and volunteering at a local animal shelter, but was dismissed from both because of a seeming inability to understand or comprehend instructions. He was arrested in 2006 for underage drinking, and in 2007 for possessing marijuana and related paraphernalia. According to a close friend, when Loughner gave up drinking and smoking pot in late 2008, quote, his theories got worse, he was just off the wall. He stopped hanging out with friends and devoted most of his time to sleeping in order to lucid dream, a topic he had become increasingly obsessed with. He faithfully kept a dream diary and developed a fascination with, quote, semantics and how the world is really nothing, illusion. And told his friend that he'd come to the conclusion that words had no meaning. Loughner attended a Giffords campaign question and answer event where he asked, quote, if words could not be understood, then what does government mean? A question answered only by the silence of the room. Loughner felt that Giffords skirted his question, and in the years to come, occasionally expressed his dislike for her and his opinion that she was a phony. In 2008, Loughner called the police to report that somebody was impersonating him online, including having set up a fake MySpace account in his name with an accompanying picture of him. That same year, he attempted to join the army but was rejected and deemed unqualified. One friend who had not seen Loughner since high school said that when they met again in 2010, his old friend had become anti-government and seemed radically different than before and asked random weird questions that didn't go together. In February 2010, Loughner enrolled in community college, where he often confused his teachers and classmates with meandering mumblings and random rants during class about the end of the world, government conspiracies, the monetary system, terrorism, and faked space flights. Eventually, in September 2010, after becoming the subject of at least 51 campus public safety reports detailing his strange and erratic behaviors, he was suspended from attending classes pending the results of a mental health evaluation. As he refused to do so, he did not return to school. Rather, he developed a sudden but strong interest in firearms, which he then started to purchase, including those he used in the shooting, and created and posted a number of disturbing YouTube videos, including one that claimed college was unconstitutional and, quote, one of the biggest scams in America. School suspension did not dampen his interests, and in a video he made just weeks before the shooting, Loughner told his viewers, quote, my favorite activity is conscience dreaming, the greatest inspiration for my political business information. Some of you don't dream, sadly. My ambition is for informing literate dreamers about a new currency. In a few days, you'll know I'm conscious dreaming. Thank you. In another, Loughner accused the government of brainwashing the populace through grammar, religion, and false currency, and asked, as he had years earlier, what is government if words have no meaning? In yet another internet posting, Loughner announced, quote, there are important figures in my dreams, Hitler, Hillary Clinton, and Giffords, to name a few, and described himself as a sleepwalker who turns off the alarm clock. Nor did his suspension from school temper his growing political obsessions. Besides his occasional rants about Giffords, he would also become enraged by images of, quote, George W. Bush or when discussing what he considered to be the nefarious designs of government. He believed in conspiracy theories about the illegitimacy of the US dollar, the 9/11 attacks, the existence of a new world order, and the impending 2012 apocalypse. Among the pictures he posted to his MySpace profile was a handgun placed upon a document titled United States History. At 4:12 a.m. on the morning of the shooting, Loughner's MySpace post stated, quote, goodbye friends, please don't be mad at me. The literacy rate is below 5%. I haven't talked to one person who is literate. I want to make it out alive. The longest war in the history of the United States. Goodbye. I'm saddened with the current currency and job employment. I had a bully at school. Thank you. P.S. Plead the Fifth. Loughner's arrest photo was quite disturbing, described by the Washington Post as, quote, smirking and creepy with hollow eyes ablaze. When asked about his possible motives, a close friend said to, quote, promote chaos, and compared Loughner's mindset to that of the Batman's nemesis the Joker, who, quote, fucks things up to fuck shit up, there's no rhyme or reason. He wants to watch the world burn. He probably wanted to take everyone out of their monotonous lives, to take people out of these norms that he thought society had trapped us in, end quote. Following his arrest, a court-appointed mental health professional diagnosed Loughner with paranoid schizophrenia and declared him incompetent to stand trial. He spent several months at a federal prison medical facility where he was forcibly administered a cocktail of psychotropic drugs, regained his sanity, and in August 2012 pled guilty of all charges against him, thereby avoiding the death penalty. Loughner was given 7 life sentences without parole, plus 140 years, and is incarcerated at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Footnote: The morning of the shooting, a police officer pulled Loughner over for running a red light. Although Loughner acted oddly, at first calm, then crying, then laughing, he was let go. End footnote. Oscar Ramiro Ortega Hernandez. On November 11, 2011, 23-year-old Oscar Ramiro Ortega Hernandez drove 2,000 miles from Idaho Falls, Idaho to Washington, D.C., and fired at least 8 rounds from an AK-47-style semi-automatic assault rifle at the White House. He quickly drove away, but crashed, ironically, in front of the United States Institute of Peace, after which he fled on foot until, 5 days later, authorities located and apprehended him in Indiana, Pennsylvania. He did not resist arrest. According to friends, he had railed against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and talked about global positioning system chips injected into people by the federal government and their use of fluoride and aspartame to control Americans. On a number of occasions, he had told friends that he was, quote, on a mission from God to kill President Barack Obama, whom he called the Antichrist and the Devil. In March 2011, he purchased more than 1,200 rounds of ammunition, the firearm used in the shooting, and a scope kit. For the next 6 months, he practiced shooting in desolate areas near his home. That October, he made 2 videos that he posted on YouTube. In them, he described himself as a, quote, cold-hearted warrior of God, praised Osama bin Laden for standing up to the United States, called for revolution against the federal government, and announced, quote, it's time for Armageddon. During his trial, he pled not guilty and claimed that someone had stolen his car, that he did not shoot at the White House, and that his statements to that effect after his arrest were coerced by the Secret Service. Ortega Hernandez was found guilty, sentenced to 25 years in prison for terrorism and related weapons offenses, and ordered to pay $94,000 in restitution. James Holmes. On July 20th, 2012, 24-year-old James Holmes, with newly dyed bright neon orange hair, wearing earphones blasting techno music, dressed in full SWAT riot gear, a gas mask, and wielding a virtual arsenal of guns, entered a sold-out midnight premiere showing of the newest Batman movie, The Dark Knight Rises, in Aurora, Colorado. Just as the film's opening sequence of violence began, Holmes set off gas or smoke canisters and then opened fire on unsuspecting audience members, killing 12 and wounding 70 others. Upon his apprehension outside the theater, he did not attempt to resist arrest. Rather, he identified himself to authorities as Batman's long-standing nemesis, the Joker, and told police that he had placed booby traps around his apartment. As promised, investigators found his apartment loaded with a complex network of explosive booby trap devices, including homemade napalm, which, despite their sophistication, failed to go off. They also found Batman paraphernalia and other, quote, evidence of his apparent obsession with the comic book hero. In elementary school, Holmes, who grew up in an upper-middle-class suburban home, was nice, well-behaved, polite, easy to get along with, popular, and extremely intelligent. He always helped to take care of his younger sister and, like McVeigh, entertained other kids in the neighborhood by building an amusing but not too scary haunted house during the Halloween season. Holmes himself later said he became obsessed with killing when he was just 10 years old, an obsession, he said, which became more realistic for him over time. By high school, he had become, according to classmates and his former coach, a sullen, increasingly withdrawn, creepy, quiet loner, quote, a kind of shadow figure, part of us but not part of us, hard to get to know, and pretty invisible. During his senior year of high school in 2006, Holmes was an intern at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, where his supervisor described him as socially awkward, uncommunicative, and stubborn. He was diagnosed with depression and once became so frustrated that he pulled out his hair, so much that he was left with a bald spot on the back of his head. After graduating high school, Holmes attended the University of California at Riverside, where in 2010 he studied neuroscience and graduated in the top 1% of his class. Letters of recommendation by his teachers described him as, quote, a very effective group leader, and a person who, quote, takes an active role in his education and brings a great amount of intellectual and emotional maturity into the classroom. In 2011, he was accepted into a highly competitive neuroscience PhD program at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical School, and received a $21,600 grant from the National Institutes of Health and a $5,000 stipend from the University of Colorado, Denver. Holmes, it turned out, had a long-standing interest in fantasy versus reality. In a home video made during this time, he explained to his peers at a science camp that he was working on the concept of, quote, temporal illusion, which is an illusion that allows you to change the past, and spoke of carrying on his mentor's interest in, quote, subjective experience, or what takes place inside the mind as opposed to the external world. The next year, however, his academic performance began to suffer. In the spring of 2012, he received poor grades on his comprehensive exams, and after failing a critical oral exam in early June, chose to withdraw from the PhD program. Afterwards, he broke up with the only girlfriend he'd ever had, warning her to stay away from him, quote, because I am bad news bears, and confiding that he thought he might be suffering from dysphoric mania, a type of bipolar disorder, whose episodes, one psychiatrist said, include, quote, getting this idea of doing something, and even if your mind tells you not to, your body moves you forward. His now ex-girlfriend urged him to seek counseling. He'd already tried that. In the months leading to Holmes's rampage, he sought help for his deteriorating mental health on several occasions from at least 3 campus mental health professionals. After he confessed to one of them that he wanted to kill people, the campus police were called, but they declined to hospitalize him. In the weeks before and after withdrawing from his PhD program, Holmes legally purchased 2 Glock 22 pistols, a Remington 870 Express tactical shotgun, an M&P Smith & Wesson semi-automatic rifle, 6,350 rounds of various kinds of ammunition, and a Black Hawk urban assault vest. Less than a month before the killings, Holmes filled out an application to join a local gun club. The owner of the club said that when he attempted to call Holmes back, he heard a, quote, bizarre, freaky, guttural, incoherent, and rambling voicemail, like he was trying to be as weird as possible. Holmes was not admitted to the gun club. Weeks before the shooting, Holmes took a series of menacing selfies with his orange hair and wearing black contact lenses. The day before his rampage, he mailed his campus counselor a notebook in which he had repeatedly scrawled the question, why?
The notebook detailed his internal debate about the best method of murdering a large amount of people, and outlined the pros and cons involved in various methods under consideration, including old-fashioned serial killing, biological weapons, and bombs.
He then debated the best location for such an act, and while he considered an airport, ultimately decided that beyond the substantial security at an airport, they had, quote, too much of a terrorist history, and terrorism isn't the message. In fact, he wrote, quote, the message is there is no message. Most fools will misinterpret correlation for causation, namely relationship and work failures as causes. Both were expediting catalysts, not the reason. Causation being my state of mind for the past 15 years, end quote. That settled, he chose his target, concluding, quote, finally the last escape, mass murder at the theater. Although after his arrest, commentators remarked that Holmes was undoubtedly delusional, his bizarre behavior during court appearances led some to question whether he was really crazy or just acting a part in order to evade execution. Holmes first pled not guilty, but after federal prosecutors announced their intention to seek the death penalty, he changed his plea to, quote, not guilty by reason of insanity, and was ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluations. To the evaluating psychiatrist, he explained that at the time of his arrest, he was under the belief that he'd only killed 3 people and wounded 20, and described his victims as simply, quote, numbers, a conglomerate mass, not real people, just kind of amorphous people, whom he could barely see through his gas mask. Except for one man, whom Holmes said remained in the front row of the theater smiling at him right up until the end, when he decided to stop shooting and calmly headed to his car. He would never forget that guy. When asked why he committed such an atrocity, Holmes explained that, quote, if you take away a life, it adds to your own value. Anything they would have done or, pursued gets cancelled out and given to me. A concept he said he'd drawn from economic theory. In the end, he continued, it was either kill them or kill himself. Killing them jolted him out of his depression. Still, he added, he believed the feds had been following him in the weeks leading to the shooting, and had hoped the FBI would arrest him and lock him away before he could carry out his meticulously calculated attack. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, delusional psychosis, as well as schizoaffective, borderline, narcissistic, anxious, avoidant, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders, but despite this, and despite his smearing feces on the walls of his prison cell, was found legally sane and sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 3,318 years. During his trial, Holmes, on a cocktail of antipsychotic medication, remained emotionless and declined to speak in his own defense. Footnote: police reportedly later retracted their statement that Holmes identified himself as the Joker. End footnote. Wade Michael Page. Unfortunately, Holmes was only one in what would be a long series of deranged acts committed by fantasy-prone lone gunmen that year and the 2 years following. On August 5, 2012, 41-year-old Wade Michael Page entered into a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, shot and killed 6 individuals, and wounded 4 others before killing himself. Page, a former Army psychological operations specialist until 1998, had a history of bad conduct while in the Army and was very vocal about his white supremacist beliefs. The Southern Poverty Law Center had been monitoring Page's racist online ramblings for 12 years prior to the shootings. Adam Lanza. Just a few months later, on December 14, 2012, 20-year-old Adam Lanza shot his mother with her .22 caliber rifle while she lay in bed, took her car, drove to nearby Sandy Hook Elementary School, fired 154 shots with a semi-automatic rifle, killed 6 adults and 20 children, and then killed himself. All of the firearms used in the massacre were legal and registered to his mother. Classmates described the, quote, pale, tall, scrawny, and autistic Lanza as, quote, a wicked smart kid who excelled in everything and graduated 3 years earlier than the rest of his class, but also a kind of weird, socially awkward, shy and quiet, remote, recluse, and nearly unknowable individual who had a, quote, turbulent childhood. His parents' separation, they said, had, quote, hit the Lanza children hard, and that Adam in particular seemed, quote, really depressed and even devastated by it. Taunted by bullies at school and in the neighborhood, Lanza spent a lot of time alone in his mother's basement playing Modern Warfare video games, including, among others, Call of Duty. Even as a small child, one relative remembered, Lanza dreamed of joining the U.S. Marine Corps. He had a keen interest in aliens and sometimes talked about blowing things up. A search of the Lanza home revealed that he, quote, lived amid a stockpile of disparate weaponry and macabre keepsakes. including a military-style uniform and newspaper clippings of other mass shooters, in his attempt to, quote, outkill the Norway nutjob. Like them, Lanza, quote, obscure in life, became infamous in death. Aaron Alexis. The following year, on September 16, 2013, 34-year-old African-American and former naval reservist Aaron Alexis arrived at a Washington, D.C. Navy yard where he worked as a contractor servicing the Navy's internet system in the Navy Sea Systems Command Building. First using an .870 Remington sawed-off shotgun and then a Beretta handgun taken from a security guard whom he shot, Alexis opened fire, methodically killing 14 people and wounding 4 others. When officers arrived, a firefight ensued, during which Alexis himself was killed. Alexis is an exception to the fact that mass shooters have overwhelmingly been young white males, though discontented Muslims in the military are seemingly a growing threat. Though described as a polite kid and typical teenager, throughout his adult life Alexis displayed disturbing, bizarre, and alarming behaviors. In 2004, at the age of 25, Alexis had walked out of his grandmother's house and, later claiming to be frustrated over the parking situation there, shot 3 rounds from a .45 caliber pistol at the car of a nearby construction worker. He later explained to police that he had PTSD and had blacked out, and only later remembered shooting at the car. His troubles, he told them, began when he participated in rescue and recovery operations in Manhattan on September 11, 2001. In 2007, Alexis joined the Naval Reserves, where he fixed electrical systems on airplanes. Despite being awarded a National Defense Service Medal and a Global War on Terror Medal, while in the reserves he displayed a pattern of misbehavior and was cited for misconduct at least 8 times before receiving an honorable discharge in 2011. Such misbehavior carried into his personal life as well, and once, in 2010, he fired a handgun into his ceiling, the bullet penetrating his upstairs neighbor's floor. He told police he accidentally fired while cleaning his gun. After his discharge from the service, Alexis retained his secret-level security clearance, which allowed him to do sensitive military work for The Experts, a contracting company that serviced the Navy's internet system. His job kept him on the road and living in hotels, and in the 7 months prior to his final shooting, Alexis worked at 7 different military bases in a number of states. Friends said that during the summer of 2012, Alexis became increasingly depressed, withdrawn, and suffered from insomnia, and compared him to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. After one bout of prolonged insomnia that kept him awake for 3 days, he sought treatment at 2 different VA hospitals. In August 2012, the Newport, Rhode Island Police Department issued a report sent to a local naval base where Alexis had been cleared to work, warning that he suffered from hallucinations and was hearing voices. His employers took no action, but after inquiries made that found him to be unstable, planned to recall him. Alexis held an increasingly obsessive belief that he was being targeted, controlled, or influenced by extremely low-frequency or ELF electromagnetic waves. After a month and a half before the Naval Yard shooting and weeks before the police issued their warning, Alexis called 911 and reported that he was hearing voices of 3 individuals emanating from the walls, floors, and ceiling of his Rhode Island hotel room. He told the dispatcher that the voices, which were keeping him awake, belonged to individuals who were following him and were being deployed from, quote, some sort of microwave machine. Alexis said he was afraid the people were going to hurt him. In a letter found on his laptop after the shooting, Alexis wrote, quote, ultra-low frequency attack is what I've been subject to for the last 3 months, and to be perfectly honest is what has driven me to this. On the Remington he used during the attack, Alexis had carved the words, my ELF weapon, end to the torment, not what y'all say, and better off this way. While often used in subtonal submarine communications, various news outlets pointed out that among conspiracy theorists, ELF denotes a technology deployed by the government to harass, monitor, and manipulate individuals, a growing number of whom believe, like Alexis, that they are targeted individuals or TIs. Footnote: other conspiracy theories, similar to those that exist about the nefarious uses of ELF weapons, surround HAARP, short for High Frequency Active Oral Research Program, a Department of Defense initiative staged out of Alaska, purportedly to study the relationship between the ionosphere and radio signals. More suspicious-minded individuals, however, believe HAARP has weather modification and control capabilities, as well as monitoring and remote influencing capabilities, the sort sometimes attributed to ELF weapons. End footnote. Justin Bork. Between 2000 and 2008, an average of 5 mass shootings per year occurred in the United States. Those numbers spiked after 2008, with 15 mass shootings in 2013. Mass shootings continued at an increased frequency throughout 2014. The carnage caused by the lone nuts has not been exclusive to the U.S. On June 4, 2014, 24-year-old Moncton, New Brunswick resident Justin Bork, clad in camouflage fatigues, a matching bandana, and an ammunition belt, and toting a knife, a pump-action shotgun, a semi-automatic rifle, and a crossbow, calmly and purposefully walked down the residential streets of Ryder Park, where he lived at trailer number 13. Bork, said witness, looked, quote, like a man on a mission. Said another, quote, he just had this blank state on his face, just a dead look in his eyes. He was calm as could be. He was just walking at a steady pace. It wasn't fast, it wasn't slow. He did not waver, not even to avoid a pothole. Within minutes, the police received a barrage of calls from concerned neighbors. The responding officers arrived and proceeded on foot towards Bork, who laid in wait in a nearby wooded area. Upon spotting them, he opened fire, killing 3 police officers and wounding 2 others, all the while occasionally yelling out warnings to civilians to stay out of the way. A manhunt ensued, during which time over 300 police searched for Bork in nearby wooded areas using dogs, armored vehicles, and thermal imaging-equipped helicopters. Residents were asked to stay inside and lock their doors, and schools, businesses, and public transportation shut down. 30 hours later, a SWAT team found Bork in a nearby yard and apprehended him. He surrendered without incident, telling officers, "I'm done." Bork grew up in a close-knit Roman Catholic family with his 6 siblings, who, along with himself, were all homeschooled. Countless friends and neighbors described the Bork family as a loving and supportive one. Bork himself later said that his home life was defined by religious fanaticism, and he was taught to believe he was a soldier for Jesus. He recalled that, as a child, he wanted everybody to like him and looked up to the popular video game character Mega Man X, member of a robot military task force who must prevent his villain counterpart from wiping out all of humanity. He built model tanks and played with Little Green Army Men with his friends, who recalled that Bork wanted to join the armed forces, that or become an archaeologist who hunted dinosaur bones. In his late teens and early 20s, he developed a love of music, played guitar, wore heavy metal t-shirts, and played Call of Duty for hours on end with his friends, who also described him as a great guy, very chilled, down to earth, and a big comedian. He was always doing impressions of popular culture icons like Beavis and Butthead, perhaps quirky but always a good and loyal friend. He was an avid hunter and, like McVeigh, had a lifelong interest in firearms, collected them legally, and was known to be very contentious about gun safety. His profile pictures on social media sites depicted him in camouflage and posing with his guns, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. He tried to join the military at 16 and 18, but, lacking a high school diploma, was rejected on both occasions. He graduated high school at 19, but by that time was too busy drinking and smoking pot to try again. A few years prior to the shooting, Bork got a job at Walmart. Coworkers there said he, quote, seemed friendly enough, but was a little bit of an outcast and always seemed to have a problem with authority, issues with parents, bosses, police, and seemed to have a hate for everything, end quote. He once casually discussed how someday he would, quote, go out with a bang and take people with him. When a group of coworkers invited him on a camping trip, he, quote, brought his rifle with him, without ammunition, which he held on to the whole night while drinking. We didn't invite him the next time. Eventually, he was fired from Walmart for, quote, attitude-related issues, being defiant, not doing what he was supposed to be doing. According to McLean's, Bork's downward spiral and disturbing descent had begun in 2012 after his father kicked him out of the house for bringing home guns after he was told not to. After this, he became preoccupied with faraway wars, gun ownership rights, a looming apocalypse, and the desire to live off the grid. Still, friends said that up until a few months before the rampage, Bork seemed like the guy he had always been. Maybe a little weird, but definitely unthreatening. In the months leading to the shootings, though, Bork had quit his job at a grocery store and reportedly became obsessed with conspiracy theories. He regularly posted musings on his Facebook account in which he expressed his frustrations with the government, police, the public's preoccupation with irrelevancy such as the Academy Awards, his support of militias and the right to bear arms, and belief that if war were to break out in Canada, the country would be too soft to defend themselves. Quote, so you're okay with the government having the weaponry to annihilate all life on Earth, but you're upset I have a rifle that holds 30 rounds, one of his posts asked. Said another, quote, obey the state, it's the law. Using the phrase, it's the law, to validate government is a fallacy. As if a codex of pompous and incomprehensible legalese magically validates coercion, theft, intimidation, and violence. In late February 2014, he wrote, quote, we live under their reign, under crownless kings. Unless the people take notice, fight, and destroy the 1%, the battle for the future is lost, because the new age of tyrants is already upon us. In March 2014, quote, the Third World War could be right around the corner. Wishful thinking isn't going to stop this one. This will not be like Iraq. NATO is vastly outnumbered by Russia and her allies. A few weeks later, Canada is one of the world's most likely targets Russia would invade at the start of a war due to pushover resistance. In early April, ask yourself, would you fight for the future of your children or grandchildren, or your family and friends, sons and daughters? The answer is no, you're too stupid to know what to fight for, because we're already losing the silent war you don't want to believe is happening. His father said that he and Bork's mother worried about their son's financial problems and started noticing a marked change in his behavior and attitude. Quote, it started to happen slowly and gradually, his worries and anxieties, his restlessness, his concerns over injustice and wars and stuff like that going on. He was over-concerned. I wouldn't say paranoid, but very worried. He was going down, down, down low, and there was just nothing we could do to reach him. Concerned, they contacted a family friend and retired police officer. They were told there was nothing that could be done. The situation suddenly appeared more alarming when in May 2014, Bork became enraged after a pair of RCMP officers who had shot and killed Moncton resident Dan Levesque the previous July were cleared of wrongdoing. One friend recalls Bork's reaction upon hearing the news. His exact words were, quote, "This is absolutely bullshit that the cops can get away with this." 2 days before going amok, he told his father that he'd had enough of authorities and their oppressive actions. When his father told him that people who think that way end up in jail, Bork warned that if they ever tried to stop him, he'd be armed, would defend himself, and would never submit. Before he set out on his cop-killing spree, Bork posted lyrics by Megadeth, an American thrash metal band, on Facebook, placed the key to his gun cabinet on his front steps, and his wallet on a table near his front door. His trailer was decorated with heavy metal posters, a large Confederate flag, and Army-themed action figures. He had a 20-gauge shotgun hung above his bed, a U.S. Army improvised munitions handbook, and an automatic rifle manual pinned to his wall, as well as a pro-assault weapons poster upon which he'd written, "I am not a fish, I am a man," and a propane tank with a bullet hole on his kitchen table. During the manhunt, police posted pictures of Bork on Twitter, and his friends began to spread news of and speculate about his snapping on Facebook. One wrote, "Fuck, he lost it." Another, "You were a friend, man." Some of his friends immediately made connections between Bork's actions and the lack of accountability for Levesque's death. One wrote that his, quote, "most respectable friend believed it was necessary to take justice into his own hands and set things right for the family and loved ones of the dead boy. He's doing this for all of us. He's righting all the wrongs," said another, to which Levesque's mom responded by writing, "It's cruel to say, but I'm going to agree with you." Upon arrest, Bork explained to police that his actions were meant to start a rebellion against an oppressive government, commented that he, quote, "felt really accomplished, and while he knew how sick that must sound to them, and knew his victims probably had wives and kids, quote, every soldier has a wife and kids, it's all about whose side you chose." The soldiers he killed defended corrupt institutions and protected the rich from the poor, and he chided one of his victims for not being a, quote, "very combat-savvy guy." A court-ordered psychiatric evaluation found that Bork had felt depressed, was romantically frustrated, quote, "disillusioned and confused from sleep deprivation" at the time of the shooting, having just worked 15 hours on 2 hours sleep, and was, quote, "probably also withdrawing from marijuana," something he used regularly, according to the evaluator, in order to help him cope with his disdain for authority figures. Bork said that, like so many shooters before him, he did not think he would survive his own rampage. Despite his lack of sleep and reefer madness, Bork had not been clinically depressed or psychotic at the time of the shooting. He was found sane, pled guilty to all charges, and on October 31st, 2014, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 75 years, the harshest sentence issued in Canada since 1962. The incidents outlined above provoked debates about what exactly could have caused these individuals to commit such extraordinary violence, not so much the reasons they themselves offered when they did, but the real root of the problem. Their atrocious acts also catalyzed or reinvigorated public discourse about possible responses and preventative and punitive measures. To read the commentary, such acts seemed easily preventable if only we could fill in the gaps of a simple formula: identify the cause by understanding the shooter and implement the proper legislative and social regulations. The initial profile narratives constructed about all of the lone gunmen framed the discussions, debates, and corresponding proposed solutions that followed. The frequently suggested causes vary as much as the proposed solutions. The shooters were poorly raised, spoiled, abused, suffered from a lack of attention, craved attention, received too much attention, had defective genes, defective brains, were mentally ill without adequate access to voluntary or involuntary treatment and services, were bullied, socially alienated, played too many video games, watched too much television, grew up in a sick and morally deteriorating society, were confused and disheartened by pervasive consumerism, unable to live up to ideals largely defined by popular culture and mass media, were able to purchase firearms, especially semi-automatic weapons, too easily, held dangerous and hateful ideologies, believed in conspiracy theories, were pretty sure the end was nigh. The actions of these deranged loners, psychopathic bullies, victims, dupes, and masterminds, we are told, demand, alternately or in combination, stricter gun control legislation, mental health screening and treatment, and a host of other measures. The author of an April 2013 Vice.com article entitled "Conspiracy Theorists Are Dangerous Enemies to Have" said the fact that a quarter of the population believes in conspiracy theories, however undefined, was, quote, "infuriating enough to drive rationalists up a tower with a rifle and start shooting," a nod to Texas tower shooter Charles Whitman. Among the worst and most ironic of these conspiracy theories, other commentators observed, were ones that purport the mass shootings themselves were staged theatrical events. Different but related are the concerns expressed by some concerning certain shooters' apocalyptic beliefs about the imminent cataclysmic end of the world as we know it and their stockpiling of weapons, an analysis all the more alarming given a resurgence and growth of the survivalist movement, in recent years now called the Prepper movement, a social milieu popularly typified by Ted Kaczynski and Tim McVeigh. Evidence of this renewed ideological threat included speculation about the influence that Nancy Lanza, Adam's secretive, high-strung, paranoid, gun-toting survivalist mother, possibly had on her son given her own stockpiling of food and guns based on her reportedly apocalyptic beliefs. The burgeoning, multidisciplinary academic field of terrorism studies understands terroristic events and actors through multiple social scientific lenses. Timothy McVeigh's face adorns the cover of one terrorism studies textbook series entitled The Psychology of Terrorism, which attempts to understand and therefore prevent terrorism by determining, among other things, the unique psychological traits of terrorists and terrorist subcultures, and includes a number of essays that use McVeigh as a case study. One of these, an essay examining the relationship between family dysfunction and acts of terrorism or mass violence, invokes McVeigh as a springboard to discuss psychological fragmentation of traumatized children and subsequent cycles of trauma the traumatized perpetrators enact upon their victims. Essayist Timothy Gallimore attributes McVeigh's love of guns, racial ideologies, and acts of terror to his having been targeted by bullies, his parents' divorce, and his military experiences. More than one essay in the Psychology of Terrorism series concerns how and why end-of-the-world mentalities are formed. One of these explains that apocalyptic fantasies have two key components. Quote, first, the idea that the world will be destroyed, and second, that a remnant of humanity will be rescued from the catastrophe, but only by suffering through a myriad of trials and tribulations. Old realities now effectively destroyed, the survivor, sometimes a previously practicing survivalist, is then able to help fashion a new post-apocalyptic world. Certainly an attractive circumstance, especially for people who feel they have no control over the fashioning of their current realities, often because of recent destabilizing personal events. While the author concedes that such end-times imaginings are a universal phenomenon, often accompanied by violent fantasies that in reality help negotiate other underlying psychological conflicts, he expresses concern about the frequency at which, quote, these fantasies lead to violent actions. Another essay says apocalyptic beliefs, quote, derive from excruciating rage and humiliation. Rather than consciously attribute the source of their turmoil to its origin, often parental, it is attributed to an outside evil that, having now been identified as the cause of one's suffering, becomes, quote, amplified to cosmic proportions. Every so often, the essay warns, a terroristic individual, in an act of misguided expression, attempts to exact vengeance upon the real source of suffering by attacking the symbolic stand-in. A very different approach is taken by Richard G. Mitchell, Jr., who opposes linking terrorists with survivalists. In his 2001 book, Dancing at Armageddon, Survivalism and Chaos in Modern Times, Mitchell argues that in constructing what-if scenarios, so-called survivalists are engaging in optimistic fantasy about the times of, quote, creative transcendence that calamitous change might bring. An act he views as rational in the face of an irrational world, proactive rather than reactive, a novel exploration of possibility rather than a retreat from or renouncement of social life, and an examination and, quote, reinterpretation of the cultural assumptions and intrinsic practices that undergird the institutional order. Still, critics of the book argue that Mitchell, in his rush to defend survivalists, ignores their tendency to act violently, often citing McVeigh and Kaczynski as examples. Somewhat similar to the previously discussed concept of snapping, and shedding additional light upon newer lone gunmen, are cultural theories about postmodern hyperreality, a condition that results from an increasingly virtual, lived experience in which, quote, every means of consumption is a simulated setting, or has simulated elements, or simulated people, or simulated products. Even those things that still seem real have an increasing number of unreal elements. As a result, it is no longer clear what is real and what is unreal, what is truth, fiction, news, and entertainment. In 2007, immediately after the Virginia Tech shootings, 21-year-old Ryan Lambourne made headlines and attracted international criticism for his creation of VTech Rampage, an online first-person shooter video game based on Cho's massacre, wherein handgun-wielding players control a character who roams a campus and participates in, quote, 3 levels of stealth and murder, making sure no witnesses are left alive. After the understandable outcry instigated by his game, Lambourne, who said he designed the game for laughs, refused to remove it from the internet, arguing that it provides an insight into Cho's mindset. In 2013, Lambourne found himself the topic of discussion once again, this time for his newest video game, a first-person simulation of Adam Lanza's Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings. The advent of the postmodern era has radically disrupted the notion of identity. In a world rampant with self-referential illusions and postmodern self-parodies, multiple simultaneous realities and corresponding selves exist and are greatly informed, even created, by popular media. In 2012, a Boston Globe opinion piece expounded on the Batman shooting by observing how, quote, it is possible for any of us of any age or gender to avoid reality all day in America by keeping our eyes fixed on our screens. While our HD flat-screen smart TVs offer untold numbers of fantasy self-images and masks from which to choose, Sometimes, quote, when we're sold a fantasy that is so well made, that seems to tap so deeply into our very real sense of imminent catastrophe, and that seems so self-aware about the fantasy itself, certain people respond to it as if it's the truth with a capital T. In this way, singular acts of violence themselves constitute reenactments of holographic wholesale violence as depicted in movies, video games, television, etc., that transform notions of reality into, quote, a terrible nightmare of violence, chaos, and cataclysm. Similarly, according to anthropologists Joseba Zuleika and William Douglas, highly public acts of violence, quote, provide an additional arena for a chamber of horrors in which imagined events are as possible as factual ones, and the latter are frequently perceived, in their senseless atrocity, as a kind of fictional reality. In fact, the ability for terrorizing events to impact larger social landscapes and collective imaginations depend upon, quote, their being played out on the hyperreal screens of electronic mass media, which themselves provide the models or scripts and inspiration for these acts to begin with. Oswald read about Huey Long's assassin, Sirhan read about Oswald, Bremer read about Sirhan and wrote about Oswald, Hinckley read about various American assassins, including Oswald, and was deeply inspired by Taxi Driver, a movie based on Bremer. When he drove to OKC the morning of the bombing, McVeigh wore a t-shirt with Sic Semper Tyrannis, or Thus Ever to Tyrants, printed on it, the words John Wilkes Booth yelled right after he shot Abraham Lincoln. McVeigh inspired the acts of other disaffected, frustrated, antisocial loner killers who mentioned McVeigh specifically in their writings. They include Columbine shooters Klebold and Harris, Virginia Tech shooter Cho, and Norway shooter Anders Breivik. Lanza kept a sizable collection of newspaper clippings about previous lone gunmen, including Breivik, and even created a scorecard for each detailing their kill rates. And so it goes. The stories about recent lone gunmen, illustrated in the above compilation of media reports, echo those told about Timothy McVeigh, who himself both enacted and expanded upon certain cultural scripts and models. Understanding McVeigh. As the FBI and American public sought to understand who exactly Timothy McVeigh was, so too did his defense team. When Jones' team mental health expert Lee Loughner asked McVeigh about his childhood in June 1995, he told her he simply could not remember much of it, and years later made the same claim to his biographers. Perhaps more understandably, it sometimes seemed as if McVeigh had lost large portions of his memory, especially about the 2 years leading to the bombing. Norton, along with defense team investigators, conducted numerous interviews with McVeigh's family and friends, and in the process uncovered a number of biographical details about their client which he'd rather they not have. Norton observed that the details McVeigh disclosed about his early life seemed idealized and often contradicted numerous accounts of those who knew him. The mental health experts retained by the Jones team described McVeigh's childhood and family life as lonely, devoid of empathy or affection, and, according to one, Dr. Anthony Simone, a perfect environment for the formation of a future terrorist. Tim became deeply disturbed and displeased after learning of the mental health experts' findings and opinions about his family and childhood, particularly those of Dr. Norton, whose reports, according to Dr. Simone, brought to light a number of other family skeletons. His reaction, Simone opined, indicated a clear affirmation of the presence of a whole lot of material in Tim's life, including the bombing, about which Tim would rather we stay ignorant. Why? The old commentary about the Emperor's clothes seems particularly relevant here. Norton and Simone concluded that in order to mask inconvenient truths about himself and his family, Tim McVeigh had engaged in a contextually embedded delusional process, and further displayed symptoms of an externalized psychosis. On the other hand, sometimes there were reasons to wonder if some of the strange things he said might have at least some basis in reality. For some members of the Jones team, a major question concerning the stories McVeigh told was whether he really believed them or not, and bizarre as they seemed, might they actually even in part be true. If he believed them and they were not true, the team would need to sort delusion from fact, but if any of his stories were true or based in truth, they were in wholly unfamiliar territory. Footnote. Clinically, the term psychosis denotes loss of contact with reality, often accompanied by delusions, false beliefs based on incorrect inferences about external reality that are firmly held to without accurate, corresponding, or sufficient evidence despite evidence to the contrary, and in opposition to what the majority of people accept as true. A contextual delusion is a belief which, under closer scrutiny, seems reasonable, even rational, when supported by the contextual circumstances surrounding it. Unlike a run-of-the-mill delusion, a contextually embedded delusion does not necessarily depend upon the truth, falsity, possibility, probability, or plausibility of the claim or belief, but rather the process through which a person arrives at a delusional conclusion, the experience of the belief, the manner by which an individual communicates and enacts it, and the extent of its negative impact upon the life of the individual and the lives of those around them. In the absence of falsifying evidence to disprove a strange belief, the possibility remains that a bizarre claim might be real. End footnote. During the first year after his arrest, the team spent considerable time attempting to decipher the roots of McVeigh's particular mental and emotional malfunctions. Ultimately, though, they found no neurological impairments or any diagnosis that could be used in a mental health defense or that served as justification for his participation in the bombing, and Jones' team psychiatrist John R. Smith found McVeigh competent to stand trial. Still, when taken together, the clinical diagnosis they assigned and profiles they constructed depict him as a narcissistic, fragmented, paranoid, delusional, suggestible, possibly amnesiac man suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as the more controversial diagnosis, dissociative identity disorder. A review of the professional literature reveals all of these descriptions to be interrelated. Narcissism refers to, among other things, a pathological preoccupation with the survival of the self, the presentation of a cold, detached, unemotional self, a fragmented self, and an inability to maintain personal coherence, a sense of omnipotence, delusions of grandeur, and fantasies of self-importance. Related to narcissism's pathological preoccupation with the self's survival are the survival functions of PTSD, and one of its most extreme manifestations, dissociation. Plagued by intrusive thoughts, panic attacks, flashbacks, insomnia, paranoia, obsessiveness, depression, and hyperarousal, the actions and general mannerisms of individuals living with chronic PTSD often seem disorganized and bizarre to others. The experience of the trauma, isolated or ongoing, results in a radical disruption of associative pathways, formation of meaning, linear time and a shattering of the self, sense of a coherent self, and continuity of self. Trauma destroys identity, shatters the construction of self, and robs the individual of the basic human need for safety. It tears apart of a complex system and fragments the personality, leaving in its wake a fragmented self. Dissociative identity disorders, or DIDs, as defined by the DSM-4 2000, are extreme, severe, and long-lasting manifestations of PTSD. While all people experience some dissociation in non-life-threatening circumstances, e.g. driving or daydreaming, dissociative identity disorders are more severe and long-lasting, expressions of dissociated states which manifest at times of acute stress. What makes them pathological or maladaptive is in part the episodic amnesia often accompanying them. DID is conceived of as a set of dissociative symptoms and tendencies thought to be a coping mechanism instigated by intense traumatic experiences, often during childhood. Such experiences include extreme, repetitive physical, sexual, and/or emotional abuse, and intense coercive persuasion wherein the victim dissociates himself from a situation or experience that is too violent, traumatic, or painful to assimilate with his conscious self. Essentially, DID is a fundamental disruption of consciousness, memory, identity, or perception of environment that produces a lack of connection in a person's thoughts, memories, feelings, actions, or sense of identity. An integrative deficit wreaks havoc with an individual's ability to maintain a sense of self over time, claim ownership of personal historical events, and the ability to differentiate between the real and unreal. Footnote: the resurgence of the DID diagnosis, renewed research efforts, and the recent growth of literature addressing dissociation, generally and as pathological specifically, dovetails and incorporates recent advances in neuroscience and trauma studies. End footnote. It was the prevailing opinion of the mental health team that Timothy McVeigh suffered from a dissociative disorder, among other disorders, and possessed dissociative abilities resulting from trauma and possible sexual abuse, which were then further exacerbated during his time in the military. McVeigh adamantly denied that he was traumatized by anything ever, and wanted nothing to do with a mental health defense, while Jones dismissed the results of their head shrinking as gobbledygook. Eventually, McVeigh's mental health became an issue between Jones' team attorney Dick Burr and Stephen Jones. Jones wrote a memo informing Burr that they had fundamental differences in relation to the mental health issue. At stake was the issue of McVeigh's personal agency. Jones wrote, quote, "Your career has been devoted either philosophically or politically towards a view that people who commit violent crimes may be the victims of emotional disturbances or racism or poverty or abuse or lack of nurturing or any other behavioral aspects, which as viewed by conservatives chiefly result in an argument to avoid responsibility for acts. Tim rejects the idea that anything he may have done is the result of anything other than his own deliberate plan and desire, and I happen to agree with him. He does not wish to be painted as a John Hinckley, and he doesn't want us to spend time trying to investigate chapters in his life. Tim's story is one that is undoubtedly repeated millions of times a year. His act, which he views as one in a series of revolutionary acts against the government, would then be belittled simply to the act of somebody who is crazy. Tim's act is no more crazy than John Brown's raid on Harp's Ferry or the Haymarket anarchist. The bottom line is this is a plea by Tim for us to quit invading his privacy or that of his family." End quote. In Jones's view, the reasons McVeigh developed dissociative tendencies were irrelevant, as evidenced in another letter in which Jones informed Burr that, quote, "there is no conceivable set of circumstances in which we would want to explain why," end quote, Tim manifested symptoms consistent with DID. Efforts to, quote, "try and uncover the best-kept family secret, when the secrets seem to be as well guarded as they are, surrounded by extraordinary defenses, will be painstaking and painful, and will create the risk that Tim will shut it off anyways," end quote. Burr responded by writing to Jones that while he acknowledged and agreed with the decision not to put on an abuse excuse case, he still felt that evidence of Tim's dysfunctional and abusive family might allow jurors to understand him and perhaps sympathize with him, but that, quote, if we are not interested for purposes of defense in why Tim developed dissociative abilities, end quote, then it did not matter what they learned about the McVeigh family. Like Burr, some of the other mental health experts, attorneys, and team members believed these skeletons were vital to understanding Tim, but they too eventually dropped the issue based on the direct order of Stephen Jones and Tim's continual requests. Thus, no more time was spent trying to determine the traumas that had separated McVeigh from himself. Jones ordered the defense team to cease their efforts and spend no more time, quote, interviewing people who talk about his mother's alcoholism or sexual adventures or his father's remoteness, as such lines of inquiry could not save Tim's life, but would only intensify the ever-widening divide and sour relationships between Tim and his defense team. Jones instructed that if during an interview with Tim or others, unsolicited information about the McVeigh family secrets was disclosed to any member of the team, they were not to mention it explicitly in their reports, but only refer to it by cryptic reference. Furthermore, the memos in the Jones collection, while rich in their current form, were sanitized in anticipation of future reciprocal discovery. The most sensitive documents were kept separate from the rest, and therefore the extent of the actual findings of the psychologists and psychiatrists were never made known to the public. The linking of McVeigh, with only scant explanation, to those violent actors who came after him, illustrates how the name McVeigh itself became and continues to act as cultural shorthand for a number of messy and complex issues for which simple explanations may not exist. In his 2008 book, Guys and Guns, about school shooters, Douglas Kellner explained that, quote, cultural studies read texts in their socio-historical contexts and situates, interprets, and traces the effects of certain texts, artifacts, and events, and contextualizes its object in its historical matrix, end quote. The McVeighs next door. Tim McVeigh's great-grandfather, Edward McVeigh Sr., left Ireland in 1866 and settled in Lockport, New York, a small town about 30 miles from the city of Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and the Canadian border. After graduating high school, his son, Ed Jr., obtained a well-paying job at General Motors' Harrison Radiator Factory, a reliably lifelong occupation for males in the region. His son, William Bill McVeigh, was born in 1940, and after graduating from DeSales Catholic High School, also began working at Harrison Radiator. Bill joined a local Catholic bowling league, where he met and later became engaged to Mildred Mickey Hill. Mickey, born in 1945 in Ransomville, New York, also graduated from DeSales, and when she met Bill, had dreams of becoming an airline flight attendant. Soon after they met, Bill was drafted into the U.S. Army, and during the 2 years he was away, Mickey attended Hartford Airline Personnel School. Bill received an honorable discharge in 1965, just prior to his unit's deployment to Vietnam, and returned home, resumed his job at Harrison, and married Mickey. The newlyweds moved to nearby Pendleton, New York, a small rural community about 20 miles from Buffalo, whose population consisted of mostly white working-class Catholic families. Mickey and Bill had 3 children, Patty in 1966, Timothy on April 23, 1968, and Jennifer in 1974. All of the McVeigh children were born at Lockport Memorial Hospital, attended Lockport's Starpoint school system, and received religious instruction at nearby Good Shepherd Church. The McVeighs lived in a series of houses in Pendleton, each more spacious than the last. On the surface, the family seemed to be living the American dream. Nearly all of the family, friends, and neighbors who knew him described young Timmy as a charming, intelligent, innovative, entrepreneurial, quick-witted, cleverly mischievous boy who shared his mother's sense of humor. His innovative and entrepreneurial ideas often earned him money. In addition to being the most popular neighborhood babysitter, every Halloween Tim set up haunted houses for the younger children who lived nearby, and a casino where, for a small admission fee, they could play roulette. Even as a young child, one of his most notable traits was his sense of responsibility. Tim was an avid collector of comic books and referred to the collection as his college fund. Liz and John McDermott lived next door to the McVeighs from the time Tim was 8 years old. They described him as sensitive, aware of the needs of others, attuned to suffering, and highly empathetic to people and animals. Liz McDermott remembered, "When we moved into our house, there was a huge toy tank, and Tim would come over and look at it often. My husband lost his job, and so when Mickey invited us to go to the medieval banquet in Niagara Falls, we couldn't afford it. Tim said, 'Why don't we have a garage sale?' I hated garage sales. I don't go to them, and I certainly didn't want to run one, but Tim took it over and ran the garage sale for us, and we made more than enough to go to the banquet and more than enough to give them the tank." End quote. Despite their seemingly idyllic, upwardly mobile, middle-class suburban life, and the outward normalcy of the well-behaved and friendly McVeigh children, a number of troubling issues brewed under the surface of the family veneer. Neighbors, friends, and family members told the Jones team about Mickey's overwhelming fears and belief that she was in danger. Mickey, they said, often felt persecuted by an unknown threat, and tended to avoid deaths like the plague, refusing to attend even the funerals of family members. A number of people stated that, over the years, they observed paranoia, quote, both in Tim and in members of his family. In one report, Dr. Simone described the work of Dr. Norton and elaborated upon the extent of Mickey's paranoia and the effects he felt this had on Tim's psyche. Simone wrote that Norton had, quote, uncovered data in her extraordinary investigative efforts of episodes during Tim's very early life, 5 to 6 years of age, when his mother would induct him into what may or may not have been paranoid delusional schemes having to do with her being spied upon. Another family friend said Mickey had, quote, always demonstrated some unusual characteristics, notably her paranoia, and, quote, would sit in the living room with the lights out, convinced that people were in the neighborhood. She was always looking out the window, always watching the window. She would do this with Tim. Sometimes Tim would call and tell us there was someone in the neighborhood casing our houses, and we should be aware of it. It seemed off to us, end quote. Whether her fears were real or not, Simone continued, her expression of them would relate, quote, to the degree to which a child experiences his world as a deeply frightening experience. Along with a younger sister for whom Tim reports having also felt responsible as to her welfare, the child in such circumstances grows to feel a singular burden for the protection of the vulnerable ones in the family. God made big men and Colt made the .45, end quote. Tim later acknowledged that his mother had always been paranoid and recalled, quote, I was at her house opening a can of tuna fish, and she worried about the magnetic code, end quote. But he insisted that her fears had no effect on him. Jones' team attorney, Christopher Tritico, said that Mickey McVeigh, quote, had a mental illness long before the case began. When you met her, you could tell she was mentally ill, end quote. Although McVeigh later claimed to more than one person that he could not remember much of his childhood, occasionally he attempted to help fill in the gaps. Over time, and in his own fragmented, inconsistent, and non-chronological way, he began to paint a troubling picture of his younger years, first to the Jones team and later to his biographers. To his attorneys, he revealed that both his mother and father had a history of mental illness, and that Bill was on some type of mood medication, a disclosure that caused Dr. Halleck to opine that there was, quote, more to Bill than we have picked up so far. To his biographers, Tim wrote that since the bombing, his mother kept saying strange things were happening to her, but it was hard to tell if what she was saying was real, as she had always been paranoid. Upon first meeting him, Norton reported that Tim was cooperative during their interview, but also guarded and highly defended, and displayed pronounced obsessive-compulsive features, including rigid speech patterns, and that he seemed uncomfortable with spontaneous, unscripted conversation, especially when it involved talking about emotions. All of the other Jones team mental health experts agreed with Norton, and found Tim's detached demeanor, emotionless affect, and difficulty displaying empathy to be traits, quote, indicative of the emotional sterility characteristic of the McVeigh family. This, they said, was observable in Jennifer, and while Mickey didn't know how to show emotion, the lack of it was a primary character trait of their father, who also seemed unable to show his feelings. One family member remarked that Tim, quote, kept his emotions inside him the way Bill did. Halleck wrote that once during an interview with ABC News shortly after his son's arrest, Bill was visibly detached, quote, so distant that he was not even there. According to Norton, Bill seemed to have, quote, very limited insight into his own personal psychology and emotions or those of his children, but rather was a hear no evil, see no evil kind of guy who would put a lot of energy into not noticing what is going on with his kids, especially when they are hurting or confused or bewildered, end quote. It was clear that, like Tim, Bill felt safest and most comfortable staying within the realm of facts, and while pleasant and friendly, had great difficulty talking about his feelings. They concluded that while Bill was physically present in his children's lives, his very passivity rendered him virtually absent. Tim said that, while usually quiet, perhaps to a fault, his publicly non-confrontational father was a perfectionist who privately had a short and intense temper. Bill, he said, was, quote, highly nervous, very excitable, and screwed up, and seemed to be always complaining about one thing or another. To his biographers, he vividly described a number of incidents of Bill's rage, and once, after recalling that he regularly went on fishing trips with his maternal grandfather as a child, added, quote, if my dad had been there to fish with me, I just wish he was. He was working 12 to 15-hour days. What he remembered most about his father, he said, was that he was great with kids, but for me, I didn't see any of the nurturing skills. I don't remember any of the nurturing. What I remember was that he was never there for anything but to yell at me. He was the disciplinarian. I don't hate him at all. He was operating on 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night, working double shifts, playing softball. Sleep deprivation will severely aggravate people, end quote. Neighbors also acknowledged to the Jones team that Bill could be overly critical with his son. One remarked, quote, Tim rarely got attention for anything good. He only heard about his mistakes, end quote, and became a perfectionist himself. A family member remarked that Tim, quote, kept his emotions inside him the way Bill did. And a family friend and neighbor also noted the similarities between Tim and his father, saying, I think Tim is his own worst enemy. He was very rigid. He was overly responsible and conscientious. Sometimes he was hard on others. He had lofty goals for himself, and he had the same expectations for others. When they didn't live up to Tim, he could get his back up. He had no use for a job done halfway." Quote. Mickey said, quote, "Bill lost his temper a lot and yelled but never hit anybody. And the children, fearing his anger, always came to her when they misbehaved and asked her to intercede on their behalf. Tim said that when his father lost his temper, he usually dealt with it by retreating to his bedroom and learned to prevent Bill's tendency to overreact by avoiding certain topics of discussion." To his biographers, Tim recounted how he felt pressured by his father to be athletic. "My dad, he's a jock," he explained. "I always felt like a failure to my dad. I wasn't a jock figure. Dad always had in mind a boy should be an athletic giant. I was thin, gangly, not really coordinated. I didn't even know how to put on a jockstrap." In order to make Bill happy, Tim joined the Little League, but said his memories of being on the team were painful, because whenever my dad would go out to play sports with me, he would recognize my non-coordination. I was an outcast. He played fast-pitch softball and wanted to warm up his arm with his son. Truth is, all it did for me back then was show him that I was uncoordinated. I couldn't really catch the ball, afraid of the ball, I didn't want to be out there, didn't even want to be on the team. My dad approached the coach after I was picked and said to him, "Tim isn't that great. Did you pick him because you're my friend?" That hurt. They didn't know I was listening. Like many children, Tim was sometimes picked on, at first for being too short and then for being too tall, thin, and uncoordinated. A number of humiliating incidents at the hands of meaner children may have led him to develop his, quote, seething hatred of bullies, of any person, institution, or even nation that seemed to be picking on the weak. Speaking of the 1999 Columbine shooters, Harris and Klebold, he said, quote, "Jocks were bullying those kids in Columbine. These jocks are taught on the field of competition to dominate others. I know these kids that were involved in the shooting, they had a point that somebody should address. There needs to be something instilled in these jocks that you don't need to dominate these kids when they're walking down the hall between English and social studies class. Most bullies in schools are jocks." Although unarticulated, by equating jocks with his father, he equated his father with bullying, a correlation that suggested his bombing of the bullies in the Murrah was a symbolic strike at his father. According to Tim, while Bill never learned to deal with his anger properly, the main thing he learned from his father was, ironically, the value of controlling his own. Quote, "I learned a deeper lesson by experiencing my dad's short temper. Surprised, huh? I would never fly off the handle without thinking through my reaction and subsequent action. I would go through life not yelling every time the situation was adverse, and I would not make a habit of raising my voice when not necessary to get results." While family, friends, and neighbors said Bill worshipped Mickey, they added that there had always been clearly notable differences between them that became a growing source of contention. While she tried to settle down after marrying Bill, the extroverted and outwardly emotional Mickey was always on the go, had a short attention span, and constantly craved attention, excitement, and social interaction. She had a yearning for travel and adventure. Domesticity seemed to both bore and suffocate her, and she was ambivalent about motherhood. Bill, on the other hand, was practical, reserved, painfully shy, and a homebody. While Bill preferred a quiet night at home on his off time, the tall, thin, strikingly sexy, and well-endowed Mickey liked to go out dancing and drinking with her friends and turned heads every time she entered a room. Mickey, said one family friend, needed more stimulation than Bill could provide. When Tim was 8, Mickey took a job as a travel agent and was away from home for increasing amounts of time. When she did have time off from work, she liked to hang out at the local bowling alley and even worked there for a while. Sometimes she would stay out all night, and when she was home, it was begrudgingly. Friends, family, and neighbors said that because Bill worked the graveyard shift at Harrison, and as Mickey's excursions and drinking intensified, there was a notable lack of supervision in the McVeigh home. A number of others drew a more damning portrait of Mickey. According to one family member, she, quote, wasn't much of a housewife, and their home was always messy. Another said, quote, "We called Mickey the Queen. She never cleaned or made her kids pick up their toys. She would come home at night and just sit there, or get ready to go out bowling or socializing. We used to joke that the only time she ever cleaned her house was when they were moving. Bill would have dinner waiting when Mickey got home from work." Others described her as materialistic and greedy. Mickey was the kind of person who always wanted more. She was never satisfied with any of their houses. Bill paid for everything in cash. He never even had a car payment or a credit card. He was a hard worker and frugal. End quote. Mickey, they said, encouraged unhealthy coping skills in her children. One close relative recalled that once, having made an unexpected visit to the McVeigh home, they found the 15-year-old Patty making whiskey sours in the blender. Mickey, herself a heavy drinker, explained that she had suggested this since Patty had just broken up with a boyfriend and it would make her feel better. Although Bill was aware of such occurrences and probably didn't approve, he did nothing to prevent it and never said anything about it. To Norton, Tim described his mother as a freewheeling, free spirit who liked to hang out at bars and socialize, and while she sometimes drank at home, he never saw her staggering drunk. Yes, she took a job when he was 8, he said, but added that most of the time she was home and always made his lunch to bring to school. During their earliest conversations, just weeks after his arrest, Tim claimed that while his parents, quote, had strife all throughout their married life, they never fought in front of the children until drinking and absences increased the tension between them. Sometimes at night, while he was trying to sleep, Tim said, his parents would argue. Often his parents' fights were about Mickey's continual demands for more sex. He later told his biographers that sometimes as he lay in bed at night, through the walls he could hear his parents having sex, but mostly just heard them argue with an intensity that frightened him. While he was still young, continued Tim, Mickey began going out drinking at night, and it did not take long before his father suspected she was, quote, sleeping around. At some point, Tim came to believe that his father's own friends became sexually involved with his mother. Family, friends, and neighbors also shared rumors with the Jones team about Mickey bringing men to the house while Bill was working. Further, based on their investigation and interviews, the team's mental health experts also suggested the possibility that Mickey, when drunk, encouraged her children to engage in inappropriate sexual situations. Footnote: the allegations of Mickey's having exposed her son to inappropriate sexual situations was based on information learned by the Jones team after interviews with McVeigh family, friends, and neighbors. I think it's fair to mention that such rumors are just that, rumors, and I have no further information to corroborate them beyond their brief mention in Jones team memos. They very well could be the result of overeager defense investigators or gossipy neighbors. End footnote. If such rumors were true, Tim would be in a double bind, a classic Freudian Oedipal dilemma, having usurped his father in actuality or by being made into a silent witness and therefore unwitting co-conspirator in his mother's infidelity. Further, true or not, given such unsubstantiated rumors, Tim's disturbance at the Jones team's early findings became more understandable. Over time, the stark, irreconcilable differences between Bill and Mickey became apparent not only to the McVeigh children but to their friends and family, and seemingly everyone else who knew them knew that Mickey had a reputation in the small town of Lockport. She was, they said, a magnet for men, notably married men. She was emotionally needy, selfish, immature, self-absorbed, a slut with a propensity for drama, and someone who desperately sought out the company and affection of men, a situation that caused many wives to become jealous of her. Jennifer said Mickey was obsessed with staying young and would become depressed and frantic without constant male companionship or attention. Everyone, it seemed, knew or suspected that she was cheating on Bill, and according to one family member, Bill knew, but he buried his head in the sand. In this story, for various reasons, people end up buried in the sand. Tim's cousin remembered that Tim had a short fuse, in general, and wouldn't tolerate his parents' arguments for very long before he would be yelling at them to stop. On the day of Tim's execution, Jones team expert Dr. John Smith told reporters that Mickey and Bill's arguments frightened Tim so terribly that he took refuge in a fantasy world where he as a hero would vanquish the bullies. A number of people described the negative effect his parents' fighting and general home environment had on Tim, and how because of it, even as a young child, he sought refuge and spent most of his time at the homes of neighbors, sometimes eating dinner and spending the night for days at a time. When his biographers asked if he loved his parents, Tim responded, "I struggle with the question. I have very few memories of my childhood, of interaction with my parents. I was often by myself or with neighbors. Most of my memories focus on that." A neighbor who acted as one of Tim's many surrogate mother figures told the Jones team that, from the time he was very young, she suspected something disturbing had happened to him in the McVeigh home, which had left him very troubled. Even as a child, Tim exhibited behaviors that indicated he had suffered a traumatic experience. His body image was poor, and he always wore baggy clothes, quote, to cover the shape of his body. I have always sensed that Tim had a deep hurt he could never talk about, and I always felt that it could have something to do with his mother, end quote. While she could never prove Tim had been sexually abused, the thought crossed her mind. All she knew for sure was that, quote, something had hurt him deeply. This was not the first allusion to possible sexual abuse. Tim found his most cherished respite at the home of his grandfather Ed, who instructed him in a variety of domestic tasks and taught him to properly handle and shoot firearms. Speaking of his grandfather, Tim said, quote, I used to nap on his couch. When I woke, we'd fold blankets together, him holding the end as I picked up corners. Eventually, he taught me how to fold a blanket by myself. I loved going to his house, end quote. To his grandson, Ed's knack for technology and mechanics made him seem like MacGyver. Occasionally, said Tim, the MacGyver influence comes out in me. As he reflected on his grandfather, Tim said the, quote, memories flood back and it is easy to recognize the value of an adult guiding presence in a household. His grandfather, he said, was a rugged individualist, and the only person he could truly claim to love. Footnote, Tim said that as a child he trashed his bedroom, threw darts at the walls, and ran string from his light switch to his bed so that he could read late into the night without getting up to turn off the light. Once he remembered he had used a rope to try and grapple out the window, but became stuck halfway down and ended up damaging the ledge and twisting his ankles trying to climb back up. End footnote. In 1978, when Tim was 9 years old, unable to reconcile her domestic role and unhappy with her marriage, Mickey moved out. The McVeigh children had a choice of who they wanted to live with, and while his sisters chose to stay with their mother, Tim chose to stay with Bill. Countless friends, family, and neighbors said that after she left, they noticed a marked change in Tim. They said he became increasingly alienated, distant, disconnected, and guarded. One close family friend said he became noticeably insecure, unable to find his niche, almost starved for affection, having an impenetrable shell around him which hardly anybody could break through. After his parents broke up, I hardly ever saw him express emotion. End quote. His best friend Steve said that Tim was clearly hurt and bitter. He knew of his mother's affairs by now and blamed her for his parents' breakup. Mickey, elaborated Steve, told Tim she was going away with one of his uncles, and when she came back said she was leaving. Tim told me his mother told him she didn't care about him. It was a particularly difficult time for Tim. He was lonely and wanted a family atmosphere. End quote. Jennifer said her brother resented Mickey's decision to leave, and after she did, quote, kind of divorced himself from Mom. Next-door neighbor and close family friend, Mrs. McDermott, said that even before she left Bill, Tim expressed anger towards Mickey. Other neighbors remembered him complaining that she dressed like a teenager, went away on long trips, and even confided his fears that she was cheating, and sometimes called her a slut and a pig, slurs one neighbor recalled he was scolded for on more than one occasion. Whether he expressed such derogatory sentiments as a child, numerous individuals reported that he did so as an adult. One former Army friend recalled how Tim would call his mother a no-good whore, a slut, never had anything good to say about his mom. Another remarked that Tim, quote, kind of had a grudge against his mom. It obviously still upset him. He generally referred to her as a bitch. He was not happy with her at all. He had no love for her I ever saw displayed. Andrea Augustine, a co-worker Tim developed a close friendship with after he left the Army, described their conversations. Quote, Tim told me his mother was a whore and a bitch. That's how he referred to her. He said that when she was with the family, she would come in drunk at all hours of the night, and that she and his father would argue. He said she abandoned him when he was a lot younger than a teenager, and that she left without warning. They just came home and found her gone. End quote. Tim denied to his defense team that he ever said anything of the sort. In fact, he remembered occasionally talking to Augustine about their families, but claimed he could not remember making these types of statements about his mother or even thinking them. While admitting Augustine had no reason to lie, he could not think of any reason why he would have said such things to her. Still, after his arrest, his Army friends told reporters about conversations they had with him that sounded familiar, if not identical, to those Augustine described. McVeigh maintained to the Jones team that these types of reports, which continually found their way into the media, were a real mystery to him. At first, he made similar denials to his biographers, but later reluctantly acknowledged he may have made such statements. I understand human sexuality, he explained to them. I personally believe nobody was made for one partner. I think marriage is a good social institution for populating the earth, preventing the spread of social diseases. Aside from that, I don't see it as natural. Why would I be mad about my mom for sleeping around? He admitted that, quote, my mother was devastated by all the allegations and accusations that I called her a bitch and a slut. It was not true. She visited me in the courthouse. She walked up to me, and the marshals were standing right there. The first thing she said was, did you call me a bitch and a slut? I probably did call her that, but who knows what problems I was having that day, what kind of mood I was in. If I was talking to Andrea, I was probably trying to get in her pants. End quote. In an attempt to save her marriage, Mickey episodically returned home to Bill and Tim, until finally, in 1984, the year Tim began high school, she moved to Florida and took his sisters with her, while he chose to remain with his father. Publicly as well as privately to his defense team, Tim denied that his parents' deteriorating marriage had any impact on him, much less traumatized him, or that it had in any way influenced decisions he made as an adult, and allegations otherwise greatly angered him. Still, the majority of accounts, including those of the Jones team, say that Mickey's decision to leave the family left, quote, deep psychological wounds and permanent emotional scars. Tim, they believed, felt abandoned, and given the smallness of the town and the way rumors circulated, stigmatized, ashamed, and embarrassed. The education of Tim McVeigh. Beyond those real or imagined threats his mother perceived, his father's anger, his parents' dissolving marriage, or other turbulence that existed within the McVeigh home, a number of external threats also plagued the world of young Tim McVeigh, which he responded to by taking an interest in survivalism. He told his biographers that, in order to understand this interest, quote, you'd have to live during my era and live my life. I grew up during the Cold War era. People had built bomb shelters in their backyards. The McDermotts had basement walls 8 feet thick. It was a fallout shelter in their basement. They told me the guy who built the house was worried about radiation from bomb fallout. My uncle's former house had its own gas tank and underground pump. During the gas crisis of 1974, I remember a neighbor coming in the middle of the night, siphoning gas from my dad's car and other neighbors' cars. Gas was gold, and it was being stolen from our driveway. That instilled a feeling of righteousness in me, a feeling that you should be able to defend your property. I wanted to sit outside and guard our property. You couldn't just shoot him because you're not in fear for your life. and you start thinking that the laws aren't in line with what I would call natural law." End quote. This, he said, along with duck and cover drills at school, caused him to adopt what he referred to as his survivalist nuclear alert mentality and fostered an appreciation for Cold War architecture. In this, Tim McVeigh was not unique. The early 1980s witnessed a resurgence of early 1950s Cold War-era backyard bunker builders, ever vigilant for threats of impending nuclear disaster, who had evolved from the mid-1970s gas hoarders into a growing survivalist movement. While nuclear war remained on the list of fears, everyone had their own individualized yet distinctly American apocalypse scenarios: economic collapse, communist invasion, urban riots, environmental pollution, natural disaster, technological breakdowns, and oil and fuel shortages. Some people hid away gold and silver and began growing their own food supply. Thousands of optimistic others, despite accusations of harboring fatalistic doomsday mentalities, were willing to shell out money to ensure their survival, leading to a financial doom boom in every major city. Entrepreneurs sold easily assembled bunkers and fallout shelters, radiation suits, prepackaged food, 2,000-gallon water and fuel tanks, metal grain containers, and medical supplies, as well as ammunition and guns, including high-powered semi-automatic military assault weapons. With the proverbial shit clearly about to hit the fan, some headed for the hills. Religious and secular survivalist communities, sometimes referred to as armed cults, began to appear throughout the United States and could be found among a broad political spectrum that included the right, left, and apolitical, as well as Christians, Jews, New Agers, and white supremacists. Some communities offered training courses where, for a modest fee, the forewarned could learn how to fight, shoot, and survive all manner of impending apocalypse. In 1983, the Washington Post reported on the building of underground condominiums in Utah and one group in the Midwest who were building, quote, anti-gravity spaceships that will leave the Earth at the appointed time and orbit until the clouds of destruction have passed. According to Tim, his preoccupation with preparedness and self-sufficiency began in earnest during the worst snowstorm to hit upstate western New York in 20 years, known as the Blizzard of 1977. Pendleton received the brunt of the 15-foot snowfall, and Niagara County was declared a disaster area. Telephone and power lines stopped working. The school, town, and surrounding areas shut down for weeks. Thousands of people were left stranded, and several died. The region's tumultuous weather compounded the turmoil within the McVeigh home. Earlier, on the evening the blizzard began, Mickey left and drove to a hotel a couple of miles from their home to meet up with coworkers for drinks, where she became stranded, unable to return for 2 days. According to some, this was the first time Tim McVeigh saliently felt abandoned by his mother, and then, only months after the blizzard, she moved out and left the state. The magnitude of the cataclysmic blizzard, coupled with his mother's absence, made a distinct impression on the 9-year-old, who, along with a growing group of Americans, began stockpiling food, water, and canned supplies in the basement, and convinced his father to buy a generator in case such a situation arose again. Although acutely sensitive to the many possible threats around him, popular culture provided potential models for overcoming them, one of the easiest to capture his attention being Little House on the Prairie, which illustrated the value of perseverance in the face of bad odds. To his biographers, Tim explained, "I watched Little House on the Prairie. I loved the show, loved people surviving in the Wild West. On the show, they survived blizzards in their little cabin. In the blizzard of 77, we faced the real threat of having no food in the house, because we couldn't get anywhere. You need to keep in mind a fundamental, it will be important later. Survivalists are, by their nature, defensive in posture. So in a real sense, a survivalist goal is an incremental effort at attaining personal freedom through separation and independence from the system. It's a yearning to live the Ingalls' life on Little House, a wholesome and pure life. I see nothing wrong with that." End quote. He found ways to cope with the many looming threats and disasters he faced, both at home and in the outside world. Those who knew the McVeighs recalled that, after Mickey left Bill the first time, Tim became increasingly distant and disconnected. According to his cousin, he was, quote, always very meticulous with his hobbies, and began to concentrate more on them. He absorbed himself in comic books, particularly Marvel's X-Men series, about a gang of teenagers who, after being exposed to radiation, become mutants and develop special powers. Under the guidance of their mentor, Professor X, the Misfits learn to use their extraordinary powers for good, often using them to thwart the plans of evil mutants and thereby avert worldwide disaster. Tim found another way to help him feel secure in a shifting and scary world when, at the age of 7, his grandfather Ed taught him how to shoot. According to his classmates, once in elementary school, Tim brought his BB guns to school to demonstrate to the other children how to properly hold and load the gun, and to show them how quickly he could shoot and reload. Towards the end of 8th grade, during the time he called his bully period, his interest in shooting blossomed into a defining and lifelong interest when on his 13th birthday his grandfather gave him his very own .22 caliber hunting rifle. Despite his lack of interest in hunting animals, he enjoyed perfecting his marksmanship on inanimate targets and seemed to have a natural talent for it. On a middle school career day survey, Tim listed his future occupation as gun shop owner. Always a television junkie, Tim McVeigh absorbed popular culture and became a close and lifelong observer of the world as seen on TV news and depicted in blockbuster movies. The two mediums increasingly merged into a new genre of popular journalism, now termed infotainment. The intriguing casts of characters and dramatic plot lines featured in news stories assured continued viewer consumption and absorption that tended to blur reality, fact, and fantasy, creating a hyper-real aesthetic for receptive consumers. In the 2 years after he began high school in 1982, the U.S. announced its possession of the first missiles. Civilians could now purchase home computers, including the first Apple Macintosh. Global positioning system technology became available. A reactor shut down at Kursk nuclear power plant in Russia. The local consequences of an accident at one Argentinian power plant declared a level 4 on the internal nuclear event scale, and technical failures at a nuclear power plant in Germany resulted in the release of iodine-131. A nuclear world war was narrowly averted when a Soviet military officer identified a missile attack warning as a false alarm, although a few months later a NATO exercise was misinterpreted as a live nuclear first strike. In 1984, the tongue-in-cheek remarks of President Ronald Reagan were overheard during a sound check. "My fellow Americans," declared Reagan, "I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." In the final days of the Cold War, as the threat of nuclear disaster loomed, the disarmament movement grew. Nearly all biographical accounts mention Tim's love of the 1983 science fiction suspense movie War Games. The hero of the movie, David Lightman, is a highly intelligent but unmotivated high school student who uses his knack for computers to hack into his school's computer system and change his grades. Lightman accidentally discovers an automated NORAD supercomputer running constant military simulations and threat/risk assessments. The system's artificial intelligence has become confused between simulated and actual threats, however, and after falsely detecting the deployment of Soviet submarines in response to Lightman's hack, the AI declares DEFCON 1, the highest state of military alert. In order to avert World War III and impending global nuclear disaster, Lightman must engage the system in a game of wits until it becomes cognizant of the probability of mutually assured destruction and ceases its planned nuclear attack on the Soviets. In his 1998 unauthorized biography, One of Ours, Richard Serrano wrote, quote, "Tim was easily impressed. Certain movies took hold of him, and he would act out their storylines and imagine himself in the center of the plots." Tim identified with Lightman. He said that even before the release of the movie, while still in junior high, he had begun exploring the emergent world of home computers. By 9th grade, he had taught himself programming languages, and over the next few years, his extraordinary talents became apparent as he designed sophisticated programs that allowed him to communicate via modem with other home computers. One high school teacher and family friend recounted Tim's self-taught computer acumen and bright mind. The school was using a Commodore PET, and Tim, on his own, created an advanced and enormously long program to locate area modems. After having constructed an early bulletin board, he chose The Wanderer as his online identity, a handle that became his first, but by no means last, alias. Known in his high school as a hacker, at the time an emerging subcultural identity for nerdy teenagers around the country, his favorite activities, as listed in one yearbook, were talking pseudocode and computers. Footnote: years later, as a result of his security clearance, McVeigh obtained a job as a guard at the CalSpan Research and Development Facility in Buffalo, New York, where, among other things, the Red Cap program was located, which, very much like the AI computer Lightman squares off with, also ran hyper-realistic simulated war games. End footnote. His close friend Steve said, when they started high school, the same year Mickey left the state of New York, Tim became much more intense, obsessive even, in his interests and hobbies. Steve described how Tim's interests continually mutated from one form to another, but whatever he did it to the hilt. He would say he had busted into other people's computers and would get convinced he was going to get caught. He'd tell me, "The feds have my house tapped. It's just a matter of time before they bust me." But he didn't quit. End quote. Tim described his interest in computers and hacking to his biographers. "I was on the internet before it became popular. I kept inputting different phone numbers. I hacked into banks, government agencies. I hacked into more shit on computers than I'd ever admit to. I had a Commodore 64 computer at home. Dave Darlak and myself hacked into people's computers from school. I learned how to charge phone calls to other people's phones. One day we were hacking around and a message came up, 'You are all on the system illegally and we'll turn off your phones.' The next day I was scared to even take out the garbage. I thought the cops would come. I got into White Sands Missile Range computer system. White Sands was a government computer, but I didn't get past their password. I loved the movie War Games. Lightman found the grid computer, and I was trying to get into that too. I saw that movie and wrote my own program. I was inspired by that movie." End quote. America's future face of terror also came of age during the advent of mass-mediated terrorism spectacles. These began in earnest in late 1979 during the Iran hostage crisis, at which time Americans learned that the United States does not negotiate with terrorists. During the subsequent Reagan and Thatcher administrations, these spectacles became firmly rooted in the minds of Americans as airplane hijackings and crashes, assassinations and bombings became recurring features in the news and popular culture. Media coverage of terroristic events became more frequent, repetitive, and dramatic in content. Throughout the 1980s, already vague common usages and official and legal definitions of terrorism, of which there were hundreds, broadened. Incrementally, understandings of what constituted terrorism and who was a terrorist became more inclusive and came to encompass a much more expansive range of groups and acts, including terroristic hoaxes and threats. Thus, the number of reported incidents of terrorism increased, as did rapidly growing state of privatized counterterrorism budgets. So too did terrorism become the subject of seemingly disproportionate media coverage. The majority of mainstream primetime mass media reports about terrorism were not only occurring more frequently, they were increasingly sensationalized in nature. Secretary of State Alexander Haig declared that the deadliest threat faced by Americans was terrorism. Footnote: in 1978, the CIA reported 3,336 acts of terrorism, after which definitions of terrorism expanded, and in 1980 the number rose to 6,714. When CIA Director William Casey expanded definitions to include actions taken by the Soviets, statistics of international terrorism incidents doubled. Although between 1980 and 1985 only 17 deaths had been attributed to terrorist violence worldwide, New York Times' coverage of terrorism increased 60%, and by 1986 the paper published an average of 4 stories per day on the topic. CBS dedicated as much coverage to the hostage crisis in Tehran as it did to the Vietnam War. The 1985 TWA hostage crisis would make up 65% of televised news content and 30% of major newspaper content. End footnote. Television viewers learned of ongoing conflicts escalated between democratized Western nations, i.e. US and Israel, and a range of independently organized and politically motivated groups and individuals in the Middle East and elsewhere. In 1983 and 1984 alone, the IRA and Sinn Féin fought with the UK. In the largest prison break in British history, 38 members of the Irish Republican Army escaped, followed shortly by an IRA car bombing in London that killed 6 and injured 90. 2 train bombings in France, also thought to be the work of the IRA, killed 5 and injured many others, and a bombing attempt on the lives of the British cabinet and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher killed 5, though it left Thatcher unharmed. 6,800 gold bars worth about $26 million were stolen from a vault in Heathrow Airport in London during the Brinks Mat robbery, only a small portion of which was recovered. U.S. troops invaded Grenada, where during a military coup, the Prime Minister and 40 followers were assassinated. A Soviet jet shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 people on board, including a U.S. congressman. Filipino opposition leader Benigno Aquino Jr. was assassinated. Several people died in the attempted hijacking of Aeroflot Flight 6833 in Soviet Georgia. 2 members of the Indian Prime Minister's security detail were assassinated. A bomb placed in the baggage compartment of Gulf Air Flight 771 exploded, and the plane crashed in the United Arab Emirates, killing 117 people. Palestinian gunmen hijacked and took hostage passengers on an Israeli bus. Hezbollah took over a Kuwait Airlines flight, killing 4 passengers on board. Their car bombs hit the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63, as well as the U.S. Marine Corps barracks, killing 241 service members. The Marines exited Beirut, but a CIA station chief, kidnapped by Islamic jihadists, died in captivity. A lieutenant in the U.S. Navy on a reconnaissance mission was shot down over Lebanon and held captive by Syrians. The United Nations condemned Iraq for their use of chemical weapons against Iran, and U.S. President Reagan called for an international ban on chemical weapons. Meanwhile, hurricanes, famines, and industrial disasters claimed millions of lives around the world. Hurricane Alicia hit Texas, leaving 22 people dead, and flash floods in Oklahoma claimed several lives, as did a tornado in Wisconsin. El Niño caused severe weather throughout the world. A famine in Ethiopia left over 1 million people dead. The worst industrial disaster in history left more than 8,000 dead and 500,000 injured after methyl isocyanide leaked from a Union Carbide pesticide plant in India. During this time, Night Stalker Richard Ramirez murdered his first known victim. Accusations of ritual satanic abuse of children by teachers at a preschool in a California suburb caused a national scandal, and nearby a 41-year-old man randomly killed 21 people at a McDonald's restaurant. In Los Angeles, a smokable form of cocaine known as crack began receiving increased media attention, and its use was being called an epidemic. It is not surprising, then, that given all these natural and man-made threats throughout the world, teenage Timothy McVeigh, already concerned with preparedness in the face of disaster, grew increasingly fascinated with Reagan-era Cold War apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic World War III survival scenarios, as seen within popular movies of the era. He later described how he grew up gravitating towards films with plots that featured tornadoes, volcanoes, floods, plagues, nuclear and man-made disasters, and scenarios where protagonists, oftentimes alone, must survive in harsh, brave new worlds. His favorites included Road Warrior 1982, ABC's The Day After, 1983, and Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, 1985, which came out the same year Tim bought his first car. Often mentioned as influential on him was Red Dawn, released in 1984, a year in which fears of a looming Armageddon coincided with, or were the result of, patriotic sentiment. In this film, communist, Cuban, and Soviet troops invade the U.S. The invaders disarm the citizenry after obtaining lists of gun owners, arresting, imprisoning, and executing some. A group of high school students calling themselves the Wolverines, led by Jed, Patrick Swayze, form a successful guerrilla resistance and are memorialized as heroes. The plots of War Games and Red Dawn, observed Stickney, feature high school students embroiled within government conspiracies that are resolved through the protagonist's heroic actions. The film's phrases and visual images within the film appealed to the gun-toting high school boy Tim. One scene that stood out for him featured the NRA's slogan, "I'll give you my gun when you take it from my cold dead hands," on a bumper sticker of a pickup truck immediately before its driver is killed by the communist villains, who indeed remove his gun from his still warm, dead hands. One of the highest-grossing movies of 1984, Red Dawn met with much criticism for its glorification of guns, violence, and mindless patriotism, its promotion of uncritical hatred towards communist and socialist countries, and its acclaimed reception by right-wing extremist and Second Amendment advocate audiences. Footnote: the title of the movie Red Dawn would be used as the military's designation for the operation to capture Saddam Hussein in 2003, an operation that involved hundreds of soldiers, themselves referred to as Wolverine 1 and 2 respectively. The remake of Red Dawn was released in 2012. The remake contained many of the same underlying themes as the original, but also some interesting differences. In the 2012 version, North Korea invades the US, and Daryl, a member of the Wolverines, who in the original informs on his cohorts and alerts the Soviets to their location, in the remake is tagged with a subcutaneous tracking transmitter or microchip, thereby unwittingly alerting the enemy to the Wolverines' hideout. End footnote. Mitchell's re-envisioning of survivalism proves relevant to McVeigh's early perceptions of the world, his responses to them, and his related narrations. Survivalists, wrote Mitchell, relish inventing new narratives, new primal means and fundamental meanings by which the world may be known. To find places of consequence, survivalists fashion discourses of pending need, speculative circumstances of crisis, and concern wherein major social institutions face imminent serious erosion or total dissolution, in which survivalists themselves play central roles in reprioritized revisioning, recover, and renewal. Survivalist discourse tailors widespread rancor and disorder to fit schemes for maximizing personal competence, actualization, and relevance. End quote. Serrano pessimistically observed, however, that, quote, the young McVeigh was thinking even then in the simplest of terms, how best to face an unfair world. End quote. Had his father paid better attention to his son, quote, he would have noticed the trademarks of many who end up on the fringes of American society, those who believe in government conspiracies and demon threats, and who trust no one in authority, reliant only on themselves. Quote, as a teenager, he had embraced fantasy rather than accept the reality of the breakup of his parents' marriage. Sometimes he could not move beyond his mother's exit from his young life, and so, to shore up his defenses, he built a fortress in his secret basement world. End quote. While other teenagers worried about what brand of clothing they wore, Tim spent his money on 55-gallon barrels that he filled with water and stored in his father's basement. When asked what else he kept down there, Bill said, quote, whatever he thought he needed, including gunpowder. If everything went haywire, he'd have it there. You know, he was into survival. End quote. When asked about this, McVeigh conceded that perhaps he did have millennialist thinking, and recalled that when he first watched Red Dawn, it fit perfectly with what he already sensed about the world. He just never quite, quote, pinned down how the end would come. All he knew was, when it did, he, quote, didn't want to have to depend on anyone to survive. If you depend on somebody else, you are at their mercy. Mrs. Hodge, Steve's mother, noted, quote, this was at the time he was trying to survive without his mom and without his dad, end quote. Steve remembered Tim's preoccupation and said even as a teenager he, quote, had an arsenal which included tents, guns, K-rations, and tear gas. He had many kinds of ammunition, including steel-case, metal-piercing bullets, end quote. Timothy McVeigh was not alone in his interests. The wider culture of survivalists had steadily grown since Tim's early brush with the apocalyptic blizzard of '77. A reportedly large percentage of Americans shared Tim's concerns about future nuclear winters, evidenced by increasing subscription rates to magazines like Survive and best-selling books like Nuclear War Survival Skills. Books such as Life After Doomsday, A Survivalist's Guide to Nuclear War and Other Major Disasters, 1980, and How to Survive a Nuclear Disaster, 1982, continued to appear on shelves. Such books offered grim statistics about the likelihood of surviving a major catastrophe, man-made or natural, and informed readers about how to improve their chances of doing so. By January 1984, headlines announced, "They're ready, the nuclear family, preparing to survive doomsday and beyond." Reports described this new survivalist culture as a family affair. Parents educated their children on the value of survival, and movies like Red Dawn, War Games, and the TV film The Day After made apocalyptic anxieties fun for the whole family. Perhaps exacerbating threats of looming doom were government agencies like the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, who announced the creation of nationwide evacuation and relocation plans, or statements like those of President Ronald Reagan, who earlier that month, in a discussion about Soviet-U.S. relations, declared that, quote, reducing the risk of war, and especially nuclear war, is priority number one. A nuclear conflict could well be mankind's last. Mitchell explored the ways in which survivalists articulate the stories they tell to themselves and others. Quote, among themselves, survivalists more often narrate than debate the cause of the coming cataclysm. Assorted calamity stories may coexist without discord, to be retold and tailored as individuals see fit. Constructing a cataclysmic tale personalized to one's circumstances is a survivalist prerogative and pastime. Once constructed, these tales accrue respect from survivalist others as stories. Quality is judged on the basis of artful drama, clever plot twists, and especially refinements and technical derails, not on the basis of correspondence to the empirical. Stories need to be believable, not provable, evoke imagination, not reveal first principles or primal truths. Survivalist scenarios are akin to contemporary legends told in future tense. Accounts of happenings in which the narrator has not yet been directly involved, presented as propositions for belief, events that could occur, told as if their probability is high. Problems ahead must be defined as both urgently compelling and manageable in scope, neither trivial improbabilities nor certain destruction. This is challenging creative work. End quote. Mitchell's survivalist's narrative provides a framework through which to read many of the threats McVeigh perceived, beyond simply reducing them to paranoia. Quote, you need to keep in mind a fundamental, it will be important later. Survivalists are, by their nature, defensive in posture, so in a real sense, a survivalist goal is an incremental effort at attaining personal freedom through separation and independence from the system. It's a yearning to live like the Ingalls on Little House. Why do I have to apologize for making sure I can take care of myself, wanting to make sure I can live without someone else's help? That is, the government's help. What would these people do if there was a terrorist attack and NYC water supply was spiked? They'd probably sue if they died. It's sort of a hobby, no weirder than collecting stamps or memorizing the batting average of some retired baseball player. A lot of the time, I don't have pity for these people who get wiped out because they didn't prepare themselves. The power plant in Niagara Falls would be a secondary or tertiary bombing target because the winds are westerly. Being a survivalist is about being prepared if the infrastructure is not there. I have a real problem with people who demonize survivalists by calling them hoarders, or say they are hoarding supplies. By definition, hoarding can only take place in times of shortage. When food and other supplies are plentiful in our free market, it is not hoarding to squirrel these things away. End quote. Interestingly, the one work of popular culture he absorbed that seemed to provide a sense of comfort or optimism, or that in any way mitigated his anxieties about the encroaching disasters and cataclysms he perceived, was the Star Trek television series. For young Tim McVeigh, and throughout his life, Star Trek held the answers to a number of ills and taught him how to ask questions about the world around him and think for himself. While many have commented on McVeigh's consumption of popular media, he obsessively talked about Star Trek in particular as a way to illustrate any number of issues, including those pertaining to the bombing and its victims. His attorneys remarked, quote, the primary extant hero/role models he speaks of are Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Captain Picard, all characters on Star Trek. He continued to speak and write about Star Trek until his execution, and many letters to his biographers contain pages of his sometimes bizarre musings about the show Star Trek Holds the Key. The social structure of the society, the political beliefs of the Federation, including the Prime Directive. To some, humanity should come together, voluntarily, not by bombs or sanctions, each nation as they're ready, for the common goal of colonization of other planets. The most important reason? Right now we have all of our eggs in one basket. Any global catastrophe, extinction event, there was an asteroid scare just last week, would wipe out not only our species, but all we've worked for, all of our knowledge, experience, and progress. However it may seem we degenerate, we have still advanced as a whole. End quote. In fact, Tim McVeigh compared nearly everything, including himself, to characters or circumstances in the show, and undoubtedly emulated them. Quote, all in all, whether it's the characters or the system of government, Star Trek Next Generation is an in-depth utopian model for the future, something for mankind to strive toward, especially in this, the bloodiest century since mankind first walked upright, a light of hope in these dark ages. How I relate to certain key characters. Picard, the most respected man in Starfleet. See my military buddy's comments about me. Picard knows all the systems, multiply proficient, highly skilled diplomat, I wish, a standard goal to aim for. Yet lonely man, keeps emotions in check. No quality I dislike or don't understand. Worf, the consummate warrior. I do consider myself a warrior. Again, see my Newsweek interview. Data, android, so no emotion. Logic rules. Data is the Spock equivalent, accesses stored memory on command, i.e. highly retentive. LaForge, chief engineer, just look at the pride he takes in knowing his shit engineering section is his, and he takes pride in knowing it like the back of his hand. Highly proficient in his field, I absolutely relate to the pride and care he takes in the upkeep of his systems. I like Picard better than Captain Kirk. Confronted with the situation, Kirk would kill people with phaser guns. Picard would say, let's see what we can do to straighten this out, end quote. Among other things, Timothy McVeigh was a bona fide nerd. The Last Generation. Tim McVeigh began high school in 1982. Based on his high IQ scores, he attended AP classes. Throughout high school, he maintained near-perfect attendance, received excellent grades, and stayed out of trouble. He never caused problems. He, quote, went to church and didn't swear, smoke, drink, use drugs, or fight. He never belonged to any specific group and seemed to get along with everyone. His classmates remembered that Tim appeared to possess an innate intelligence. He could just show up to class and ace every exam placed in front of him without having studied. He continued to collect rare coins and comic books, did not like math class but liked earth science, and had a crush on a girl in his biology class whom he thought was both pretty and intellectual. In his freshman year, he joined the football team, then the track team in his sophomore year. In his junior year, he was elected to student council and, with money he had squirreled away, purchased his first car. In his senior year, he began working at a nearby Burger King, and upon graduation, his classmates voted him most talkative, because he never talked, or because of his ability to talk to anybody, depending on who you ask. Steve Hodge and his mother said Tim was an extremely conscientious teenager, always prepared, and the type of person who always kept big ropes in the car so that he could help people in trouble. I remember he always wanted to help people. He would get real excited if he heard about someone who needed something. He'd come over and say, "Come on, we've got a mission," end quote. Likewise, his teachers remembered him as a quiet, well-liked, conscientious, cooperative, and helpful people-pleaser. One classmate said he was always trying to please other people by doing extra help, being extra funny. He went out of his way to make people laugh and to like him. He was always on the outside trying to fit in. Others, including one classmate, offered a more contradictory and divided picture. Tim, he said, was outgoing and active, but also an unconnected loner on the fringes of teenage social life. Similarly, a family friend told the Jones team that Tim was always on the outside looking in, wanting a place to fit in. He never quite made what he wanted to make or achieved what he wanted to achieve. It seemed like no matter what he did, he didn't quite make it, not as a son to his mother or father, or in any of the groups the other kids were involved in. His classmates never knew him to date girls, nor did they recall his attending the senior prom. According to Tim, his parents never mentioned, much less discussed, sex with him, and whatever he knew about the subject he learned on his own. One remembered that Tim rarely, if ever, dated, and thought the problem was that he set his sights too high and tried to ask out girls that were out of his league. Tim himself claimed that he lost his virginity in his junior year to an older married woman he worked with at Burger King, who liked his stamina and the fact he was a young buck. The affair lasted about 3 weeks and then fizzled out. Soon after, he began dating another co-worker around his own age named Sarah, name changed, who said Tim was loud and goofy and tended to drive frighteningly fast. To her, he seemed lost, almost as if he were raising himself, and he had an obvious resentment of his mother. They dated for about 6 months, but he broke up with her soon after he graduated high school, telling her he was not ready for a serious relationship. Tim elegantly explained to his biographers that it was with Sarah that he began to explore his sexuality. Quote, "I was interested in another girl. Sarah was a little plump, she was interested, I was horny, I got Sarah on the pill, I was an honorable kid, took her to Planned Parenthood clinic in Lockport. I took her to her senior prom. She was my coming-of-age girl," end quote. Sarah was the only girlfriend Tim McVeigh ever had. His only other known sexual partners were, like his mother, married women, often the wives of close friends, including those of future co-conspirators Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier. After his arrest, allegations that he was still a virgin or disinterested in either sex in general or women specifically particularly offended him. Quote, "Asexual? No way. I had no long-term love relationship, never met a woman I loved. That doesn't mean I didn't have sexual relationships. I'm very discreet. I don't need to brag about the women I fucked. We kept it quiet. I never obsessed on one girl. If a girl I asked out said no, I said no problem," end quote. Meanwhile, after moving to Florida with her 2 daughters, Mickey began drinking more heavily, and her behavior became more erratic. She seemed to see herself more as a friend than a mother, and occasionally brought her daughters to the bar and encouraged them to drink with her. Late one night, Jennifer received a call from someone at a local bar who said her mother was plastered and needed to be picked up right away. When Jennifer arrived, she found Mickey, drunk and stoned, had accidentally locked herself in the bathroom, bumped her head, and could not remember how to get out. Jennifer became increasingly wild and depressed under Mickey's roof, and began drinking regularly and using drugs herself. Mickey seemed unable to settle on one location. Jennifer said that in the year after she moved to Florida, she lived in 4 different places and attended 3 high schools. Her grades began to drop significantly, and unhappy with her life in Florida, Jennifer returned to the Buffalo area to live with her father. The hard-working but detached Bill also seemed unable to provide the type of structure she needed. Jennifer said she would, quote, go to bed every night with a bottle of Jack Daniels and drink until she passed out. Her father never said anything to her about it. As countless books about survivalism popped up in the 1980s, writers in other genres capitalized on the trend by selling books such as How to Survive Your Marriage and How to Survive Your Job, as well as an increasing number of children's books about kids abandoned by their parents because of various natural or man-made disasters. The trend coincided with increased divorce rates, single-parent families, and a growing number of working mothers. During this time, divorce rates slowly increased from about 12% in 1982 and 1983 to 13.4% in 1985. No longer the exception to the rule, by the mid-1980s, latchkey kids were becoming the norm. In 1985, 60% of mothers in Canada worked outside the home. Related books appeared, including The Handbook for Latchkey Children and Their Parents, a complete guide for latchkey kids and their working parents. While he denied it had any negative effect on him, Tim often brought up the lack of supervision in the McVeigh home. Quote, when I got home from school, my mother wasn't there. These days, he said, kids get home, there is no parental influence in the household. Parents are working. Much of this he blamed on the women's movement, which he felt had removed mother's presence from home life. Tim felt the previous baby boomer generation had full parental influence, while his, Generation X, had some sense of it, and the next, Generation Y, would have almost none. Sometimes, in letters to his biographers, he advised them to spend time with their children, as they were in that age where they really need you. The effects of this trend on children became a subject of debate and study. Generation X, the first to live fully within the themes of postmodernism, inhabited an unpredictable, rapidly mutating, and crisis-ridden world, and faced an extremely uncertain future in which previous boundaries dissolved. Beyond the breakdown of traditional nuclear family norms, the baby boomers left their progeny to contend with a sense of political cynicism, new technologies, information and media overload, identity crises, high unemployment rates, a complex and fragile global economy, and frightening era of war and terrorism, and domestic militarism. Many speculated that the growing numbers of Generation Xers fending for themselves were more likely to have behavioral issues, low self-esteem, depression, to abuse drugs, smoke, drink, become promiscuous, cynical, and reject authority. Studies and news reports dubbed the latchkey kids of Tim's generation the lost generation, and described them as rootless, disillusioned, and apathetic, indifferent, cheaply employed, and frustrated people. These slackers were not particularly lazy, just cynical and skeptical. Unlike their baby boomer parents, who still tended to remain at the same job for most of their adult lives, Tim's generation tended to be more nomadic, and, while not loyal to geography or employment, were loyal to their friends, disliked being labeled or categorized, less shallow, less materialistic than parents, and eschewed the American dream. On the other hand, they had enjoyed the possibilities of technologies, identities, and entrepreneurial adventures unimagined by previous generations, and were thought to be less materialistic and more independent, self-reliant, confident, socially and technologically savvy, perhaps even the most technologically sophisticated, and possessing the widest repertoire of media literacy. By the late 1990s, banks and home builders speculated that, as they grew into adulthood, what Generation X wanted more than anything else was a sense of community, stability, and permanence, both domestically and in employment. On becoming John Rambo. By the early 1980s, the economy of Western New York, in recession for decades, had reached an all-time low. Within the city of Buffalo and its outlying areas, flour and steel mills and auto factories closed, leaving thousands without jobs. Part of a larger pattern of deindustrialization nationwide. Unemployment rates reached record heights as wages, property values, and the area's population declined drastically. The cityscape of Buffalo was quickly decaying into a landscape of despair. The streets appeared deserted, buildings were abandoned, and houses boarded up. Buffalo's civic spirit seemed decimated by the economic blight, and its populace suffered from a shared inferiority complex. Harrison Motors, which employed both Ed and Bill McVeigh, itself subject to cutbacks and layoffs, was no longer a reliable option for recent graduates like Tim. Increasing numbers of area high school students dropped out, or, if they did graduate, chose not to pursue higher education, as college did not guarantee employment. Having earned a small state scholarship, Tim enrolled in computer programming classes at nearby Bryant and Stratton Business College. He received a 99% on the school's math aptitude test, the highest in the school's history, and failed to achieve a perfect score by only fractions. Within a few short months, however, he began to feel unchallenged, grew bored, and quit. He later explained, "I knew as much as most of the teachers. I wanted to learn the why of things, not just the what." The majority of biographical accounts emphasized that Tim's love of and later obsession with guns originated from the intense bond he shared with his grandfather, but those who knew the McVeigh family noted that he also shared his interest in weapons with his mother. Footnote: after her son's arrest, when the FBI questioned Mickey, she could provide little details about his life after she moved to Florida. While she was unable to recall his medical history, where he was in the years before the bombing, or who his friends were, according to the FBI report at least, she did remember many of the guns her son had owned and could describe them in detail. Among them, she told the agents, were a .357 Magnum Desert Eagle, a .44 Magnum Desert Eagle, a .357 Python, and a .45 Magnum Desert Eagle. End footnote. When Tim was 18, Mickey returned briefly to the Buffalo area, applied for a pistol permit, and convinced Tim to do that as well. In April 1987, on his 19th birthday, he applied for and received a New York State concealed firearms permit. For both Mickey and Tim, guns may have been a symbolic cure for the ill-defined, elusive yet impending threats felt by both, and for him, a form of preventative self-defense. Having decided that guns were a better investment than comic books, Tim sold his sizable collection that, as a boy, he had considered his college fund. He got a job at the Johnson Country Store, a gun shop in his hometown of Lockport, and along with his friend Dave Darlack, purchased 10 acres of land in Olean, New York, where Tim sometimes spent days camping and firing his guns on the shooting range the two had built. In the fall of 1987, having given up on the idea of college, he got a second job as an armored truck driver at Burke Armored Security in Buffalo. Tim bragged that his coworkers there nicknamed him the Kid because I could outshoot virtually everybody. His fascination with firearms emerged within the broader context of an American gun culture and the growing survivalist movement. All presidential candidates during the 1988 elections were members of the NRA, and there were firearms in nearly half of all American homes, with a reported 60 million handguns and 10,000 machine guns in circulation. Throughout the country, a growing number of ordinary citizens purchased 9mm pistols, 22 automatics, 45s, 12-gauge shotguns, Uzis, MP5s, 9mm submachine guns, untold rounds of ammunition, armor-piercing shells, and shot at old TVs, computers, and paper targets depicting commies and Ayatollah Khomeini. These weekend warriors, the Washington Post noted in 1985, had joined paramilitary groups, terrorists, survivalists, and neo-Nazis. By his late 20s, Tim McVeigh would be associated with and come to represent all of these types of people. Reinforcing the widespread American bunker mentality at this time were widely popular television shows like Magnum P.I., The A-Team, Airwolf, and MacGyver that featured heroic narratives about the exploits of often resentful, disgruntled, renegade Vietnam veterans. Perhaps important to the construction of stories McVeigh would later tell, the A-Team consisted of 4 former members of an Army Special Forces crack commando unit who had fought together in Vietnam. After a superior officer framed them for a bank robbery in Saigon as part of a political ploy, they were convicted and sent to prison by a military court for a crime they didn't commit. After escaping from a maximum security stockade, the A-Team found refuge in the Los Angeles underground. Now forced to live on the run, hunted by military police and intelligence officers, they survive as soldiers of fortune. Despite being wanted by the government, each week the A-Team, out of the kindness of their heart, came to the rescue of innocent and wronged citizens who sought out their help. Hollywood joined in, generating millions of dollars in ticket sales and merchandise for films such as The Deer Hunter, 1978, Apocalypse Now, 1979, Platoon, 86, and Full Metal Jacket, 87. While traditional war films told stories of soldiers banding together to defeat common enemies, post-Vietnam blockbuster films centered on recurring themes of missing POWs abandoned by their government, traumatized and deranged combat vets plagued by debilitating flashbacks. Quote, "My lies killer zombies come home, dripping blood and lunacy, a metaphor for madness itself." These films aimed to resolve lingering conflicts surrounding the country's recent humiliating and shameful war by telling fictionalized versions of historically uncomfortable tales, thereby conquering the collective nightmare of the Vietnam War through the construction of shared national fantasies and newer mythologies about it. The hyper-masculine, hyper-violent war hero action films of the 1980s depicted macho protagonists who face Herculean obstacles and challenges, but who nevertheless display military heroism, selflessness, camaraderie, and principled dedication to a cause larger than themselves as the highest form of life. In this newer generation of war film, the hero, willing to use any means at his disposal, positions himself at the forefront of chaotic violence and, for the most part, prevails in the end. The most notable of these films was the Rambo series, First Blood Part 1, 82, Part 2, 85, and Part 3, 88. In them, the protagonist, John Rambo, emerges as a symbol of restored masculinity, betrayal, and revenge in the aftermath of Vietnam. While criticized for its revisionist, cliché, and jingoistic depictions of an ultra-macho, all-American vengeance wreaker, a nationwide Rambo fever engaged nonetheless, as evidenced by millions in box office sales. Tim, too, had caught Rambo fever, and the affliction would soon consume him. It was at this time that Tim, an avid reader, first encountered and began to devour a new type of literature, highly influenced by post-Vietnam cultural imaginings. Hoping to develop his marksmanship further, he began frequenting local gun clubs and area shooting ranges, where, according to Stickney, Members subscribe to literature whose content ranges from information on various weapons to right-wing paranoia pamphlets that claim the federal government's main goal in the future is to disarm America. He gravitated toward publications such as Soldier of Fortune magazine, or SOF, that describes itself as pro-Second Amendment, U.S. military, strong U.S. defense, police and veterans, ardent supporters of the basic freedom of mankind, and against tyranny of all kinds. SOF, criticized for its unabashed anti-leftist leanings, backing of Nicaraguan Contra rebels, and recruitment of American mercenaries to train them, it attracted a growing number of readers, many of whom, while too young to have fought in Vietnam, grew up viewing images of it in popular media. The magazine also appealed to the increasing numbers of survivalists who, like Tim, hoped to learn the tricks of staying alive after the collapse of civilization. Footnote: SOF was founded in 1975 by Vietnam veteran, former Green Beret, and mercenary for hire. SOF reports on warfare, insurgencies, and terrorism worldwide. The controversial magazine is known for its recruitment of mercenaries and guns-for-hire advertisements. Other examples of such literature include Scope, a Second Amendment rights publication that also dealt with other government intrusion issues, in such articles as "The FBI wants ability to wiretap 1 in 1,000 Americans." End footnote. SOF and other similar publications soon became a permanent staple of his literary diet. And then one day, in the back of SOF, Timothy McVeigh found an advertisement for the 1978 book The Turner Diaries, written under the pseudonym Andrew MacDonald by former physics professor William Pierce, founder of the National Alliance, one of the most notorious and highly organized racist organizations in the country. Set in the not-too-distant future, the book contains the fictitious diary entries of Earl Turner, who believes that increased multiculturalism and restrictive gun ownership legislation, the Cohen Act, poses a threat to the white race whom the Jews, and their minions, the blacks, hope to enslave and annihilate in order to establish a Zionist occupational government, or ZOG. Turner organizes underground cells to wage war on the system by committing acts of terror including assassinations and bombings in order to destroy the repressive government, eradicate the non-white population, and establish a utopian white homeland in the northwest United States. Turner and his gang of white freedom fighters achieved success after using a truck bomb to destroy a supercomputer housed in an FBI building which tracks and databases all U.S. citizens, especially those who, like Turner, opposed ZOG. For groups like Pierce's National Alliance, the concept of ZOG, or the formation of an all-white homeland, was a central ideological tenet of the larger growing white power movement, who praised the Turner Diaries for its prophetic wisdom and sought, with surprising success, to spread its message to impressionable, disaffected American youth. During the late 1980s, white power movement spokespeople began to attract the attention of mainstream media, thereby further garnering alienated followers. As the white power movement grew in numbers, so too did the frequency of hate crimes and white power movement participant arrests. Considered a Bible by various white supremacy groups, the Turner Diaries also gained a larger audience within broader right-wing paramilitary circles. While disparate, their ranks included Second Amendment advocates, survivalists, common law and sovereign citizens groups, constitutionalists, and disgruntled farmers, all of whom gravitated to the book's unabashed pro-gun message and anti-government themes. Widely referred to later as the blueprint for the Oklahoma City bombing, by all accounts, Timothy McVeigh became obsessed with the Turner Diaries, and its influence upon the formation of his political and racial ideologies is undeniable. The Turner Diaries, he said, not only helped him understand his co-workers' racism, but, quote, exposed me to racism I wasn't familiar with. It's very anti-black. But that later he realized, everyone is an individual. He said that prior to working at Burke, I didn't have a racist bone in my body, and was oriented more towards, quote, the survivalist crowd. Put away your food supplies for a year, get ready for whatever disaster would be coming along, nuclear, natural. Burke was the first time I ever was exposed to racist comments. From them, I learned the vernacular of racism. I picked up on it. Footnote. In the years leading to the bombing, Tim gave away countless editions of the Turner Diaries and sold it at gun shows. Like Mark David Chapman's obsession with The Catcher in the Rye, McVeigh had the book in his possession constantly, made several calls to its author and his followers, gave it out to everyone he could, and had cut out and handwritten portions of it with him at the time of his arrest. Works about the bombing or McVeigh tend to ignore, downplay, or emphasize his racism, as well as his alleged associations with various white power movement organizations, spokespeople, and deterrents, or their possible role in the bombing. End footnote. Publications like Soldier of Fortune and the Turner Diaries bolstered his already existing survivalist leanings. They exposed him to, and familiarized him with, previously unknown subcultural realms and ideas, provided new models for him to draw from in the shaping of his identity, and ultimately played a pivotal role both in the commission and narrative constructions of the OKC bombing and other acts of violence by the extreme right. In a sense, McVeigh made real the deeds of the fictional Earl Turner. Meanwhile, Burke quickly promoted the responsible and trustworthy 19-year-old Tim McVeigh, assigning him to high-profile sites, including the Buffalo Federal Reserve Bank, despite his occasional juvenile antics and increasingly odd behavior. Tim had, quote, started out as a good employee, but for whatever reason, his parents' divorce, his failure at college, his inability to connect with women, or maybe his indulgence in survivalism, he began having problems. His co-workers at Burke, quote, saw Timothy McVeigh most high school students never knew, a man influenced by war and weapon literature, angry over his home life, and living in a survivalist fantasy world. According to his supervisor, Tim was a good, reliable employee who always did his job. Tim, he recalled, had a fascination with armored cars, described himself to others as a survivalist, and told of his hopes to build his own underground bunker someday. His co-workers remembered his interest in guns, his impressive collection of firearms, he always carried one or two on him, and that he was one of the best marksmen on the shooting range, a true crack shot. Sometimes, they said, he tried to be funny, and once showed up to work dressed like Rambo, decked out in camouflage and ammunition belts crisscrossed over his chest, looking like he was ready for World War III. Despite his earlier praise, upon further reflection, his supervisor recalled that two of the other men assigned to ride with Tim complained that occasionally he put on earplugs and turned the radio up to its highest volume. In fact, he added, Tim once threatened to blow up the house of the neighborhood children who had thrown snowballs at his truck. Co-workers said that at some point he began to act increasingly high-strung, hyperactive, jumpy, erratic, intense, and began carrying more guns with him to work than he could ever possibly need. His temper had grown shorter, and some days he became angry at the drop of a hat, only to just as quickly calm down again. Other days he was silent and acted like an introverted, preoccupied loner. According to McVeigh, though, if he had acted oddly, it was due to overwhelming amounts of stress, partly from working two jobs. This left him worn down and sleep-deprived, a state known to induce erratic and paranoid behavior. He would use this excuse to explain similar observations made by others. It was during this time, McVeigh reflected, that he grew disenchanted by the mundane and developed an overwhelming personal desire for a larger purpose in life, a warrior's code of honor as depicted in films like Rambo. He sought structure, purpose, camaraderie, and guns. Later he could and did cite long passages from the Turner Diaries from memory, and evoked a particular favorite one to illustrate his growing sense of oppression. Quote, the chains that bind us are formed slowly, one link at a time, so we never notice the additional weight of one additional link, but eventually it forms a chain. McVeigh said, quote, I loved that passage. It was right on. Most Americans could give a shit as long as they have a six-pack of beer and their TV is working. On May 12, 1988, shortly after his 20th birthday, Timothy McVeigh, alone, drove to the Federal Building in Buffalo, New York, walked into the Army recruiter's office, and informed the recruiter of his desire to become an airborne ranger, Green Beret, or member of the Special Forces. The man assured him he could pursue this vision once he completed basic training, and so he enlisted in the U.S. Army, took his general aptitude test that same day, and his physical a few days later. According to his enlistment documents, he was 6'1" and 150 pounds, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and 20/20 vision. He was in good health, having no prior medical or dental issues, no allergies, and no prescribed medications. Childhood friend Sam Dangler, name changed, said that growing up, Tim had been a very pro-government type of individual, was a fan of Ronald Reagan, and at 18 registered with the Republican Party. So his decision to join the military made sense. According to Steve Hodge, though, it was not patriotism that propelled him, but his interest in survivalism. Tim believed the Army could provide the best weapons and survival training. His legal team believed he joined the Army seeking truth and to fill a central core of meaning absent within him. Brandon Stickney thought his decision was influenced by the works of fiction he devoured that depicted the heroics of war and led him to believe his future lay in commanding men in distant lands he'd only ever read about. Or perhaps, Stickney continued, Tim thought he would become a member of, quote, the elite forces, that special breed of man set apart from the rest, a man who was authorized for secret missions. Even Tim later acknowledged that he based his decision to join the Army, in part, on his desire to buttress his survival skills, and viewed it as equivalent to spending 4 years in college, but also on the powerful influence of his favorite movies, notably Rambo: First Blood and Missing in Action. Whatever his reasons for joining, while he claimed to be so at the time of his death, upon enlisting, Timothy James McVeigh was no longer fully the captain of his soul nor master of his fate. Rather, he became the property of the United States Army, and the chains that would bind him proved strong ones indeed. Timothy McVeigh had just joined an experiment in progress, one from which, psychologically, there would never be an exit strategy.